Thanks for joining us. Yes, we will share the recording far and wide. Someone just asked with anybody who wants to hear it. It's fully open and accessible. Thanks for asking. So before we get started, and I'm going to turn it over to Jim McCready in a minute to give a welcome and introduction, I just want to start with a traditional acknowledgement for our First Nations and Indigenous folks. The Ontario Woodlot Association and the Eastern Ontario Model Forest wish to honor the Indigenous people who have been the protectors of this land known as Turtle Island for more than 10,000 years. We begin this meeting by acknowledging the land on which we gather is the traditional territories of many Indigenous communities and First Nation people who continue to live and work here. Today, our gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and acknowledging this reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. Big witch. So folks, I'm John Piano, Executive Director of the Ontario Woodlot Association and Eastern Ontario Model Forest. Before we start, I'll turn it over to Jim McCready, who's overseen and been kind of the visionary behind getting all of this done with Oak Wilt and the team, the panel. So Jim, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. So happy that you could join us here today. This webinar is being brought to you by the Regional Forest Health Network, which is and partners with the Eastern Ontario Model Forest, and we're so glad we can share it with the rest of the province. It was the partners who decided that Oak Wilt was a top priority for them. We are made up of partners from Eastern Ontario, Western Quebec, and Northern New York State, and we do have Oak Wilt over in New York State, and we're very concerned about it coming across the St. Lawrence. And recently, we have been battling LDD, but it was the partners that said we have to have something on Oak Wilt, so we're presenting that to you today. And it was also the partners that said we want it later in November after our field work is done, so this is why we're presenting it to you today. This is part of the Early Detection Rapid Response Agreement between the Invasive Species Center and the Eastern Ontario Model Forest, and it is funded by the Trillium Foundation, and that's who's helping us bring that to you today. I've got to thank Richard Wilson for helping me put this together, and I have to thank also Aaron, Sharon, and Bruce for volunteering their time, putting a presentation together and presenting it to yourself. And also, I have to thank John Pino for being our moderator. One of the things of real concern to us right now is we don't have Oak Wilt. We don't want to get Oak Wilt. What we have to do is give you folks out there all the tools to recognize this, so that if it is found, we can jump on it very quickly and we can report it to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, so we can get it, excuse me, get on it very, very quickly, and so it does not spread. So sit back, and we have got 4 great presenters that can deliver this to you, and they are very experienced. And hopefully this gives you the tools that you will need if we ever find this in Ontario. Thank you very much. And let's get on with the panel. I'll turn it back to our moderator, John. John?
Thanks, Jim. And yeah, so just a few housekeeping items before we get started. There's both a chat and a Q&A function, and I can see someone's already using the chat. And we can use that, and I'll do my best to moderate and make sure at the end of each presentation that questions can be answered. And we've allotted a certain amount of time at the end of each presentation, and we can probably have a bit of time at the end for anything we've missed with all the presenters. So that's the way we can do that. You can use the Q&A to type something in, or you can use the chat. So we can't hear you or see you. That just makes it really good for the panelists to be able to speak and and us to be able to manage the whole meeting really well. And the other sort of key thing is this is being recorded. So if you miss part of it or you come in late, I guess people who are coming in late won't hear this yet, but it will be made available far and wide and fully open and accessible to anyone and everyone. We want to get the word out. So again, thanks for joining us. We're up past 160 attendees, participants. I'm sure we'll get more. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Richard Wilson to kick off the presentations. And I've known Richard for quite a few years. I think you're retired now, eh, Richard?
I am.
Yeah, like so many of us, still working though in one way or another. But I knew you for all your good work with the Ministry of Natural Resources in the day, and saw many of your presentations over the years on infestations and disease and that, and it really helped keep us informed on what's going on out there. So thanks for presenting, and I'll leave it to you to start off.
Okay. Whoopsie.
And we can see your screen. Oh, that's great.
See the screen. Well, thanks for that introduction. So I am Richard Wilson. I was the forest program pathologist for the province of Ontario for 20 years and just recently retired just before COVID. So thanks for the invitation, and I'm always glad to speak about oak wilt and any other disease. So I'm going to cover a bit of the biology, range, and impacts of oak wilt disease in this 45-minute presentation. And just before I start off, I'd like to say that if you're going to come away with anything from this presentation, there are 5 sort of very important points I want you to leave with, and there will be a lot more hopefully you'll remember. The first one is that this oak wilt disease is a highly deadly oak disease. It kills trees very, very rapidly, sometimes as quickly as within 2 weeks, and it is aggressive. It's caused by an exotic fungal pathogen, Bretziella fagacearum, which is a very highly virulent pathogen that causes oak wilt disease. So this is the fungus that causes the trees to die, and it is like any other invasive species that we've had as a forest pathogen I'll talk about in a minute. It spread very quickly. It affects all species of oak, so it doesn't matter what species of oak tree you have, it can be infected, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. And I'm just going to turn this phone off because for some reason I've gotten too many calls coming in. It's spread by sap beetles, often called picnic beetles, and through root systems. And I'll go through that in some detail. But the important point, and why I think we're so concerned in Ontario, it's now about approximately 500 meters away from the province of Ontario and Quebec even. And that's a real concern for us here. So before I start on oak wilt, I want to just mention some established and emerging tree diseases that you should be familiar with. And this will put oak wilt hopefully in perspective for you. So if you look on the left-hand side of this chart here, you'll see that we have white pine blister rust, beech bark disease, American chestnut, blight, Dutch elm disease, butternut canker, dogwood anthracnose. If you're in the forest industry in Ontario, or even a resident down in Southern Ontario, you're probably very familiar with some of these diseases. And some of these diseases have caused great concern and a lot of damage. It's cost us millions of dollars in managing these from a forestry perspective, and probably even more money from an urban forestry perspective. If you're familiar with Dutch elm disease, then you know how much damage it's done to the communities, especially if you're my age, because when I grew up in downtown Montreal, there were millions of elm trees in my community, and now it's very hard to find one. If you're familiar with white pine blister rust and beech bark disease, both have been in this country for over 100 years. Both of them have caused the forest industry, both in the United States and Canada, millions of dollars. In fact, there's some areas in some provinces, like even Quebec, where they refuse to grow white pine because it's so difficult to do. So I'd like to put that in perspective with oak wilt of what damage that could do to us. So let's look at oak wilt, and I'm going to start this presentation from a high altitude. So let's look at some symptoms if you're flying at about 500 or 5,000 feet level. If you look down on the ground, you might see a pocket of trees that look something like this. You can see a sea of green trees, but you can see some trees with some discoloration. That means, or is indicating that there's something not quite right with those trees. In this case, we know they're oak trees, but if we saw a pocket like this, we might say, what's going on with those trees? If we look a little closer, or sometimes with the different lighting, because when you're flying at low elevations, it's very hard to pick up these pockets sometime. But this one's pretty distinct. You can see some light colored trees, skeleton of trees. You can see some discolored trees in the center. And around the perimeter by the green trees, and I'm not sure if my pointer works here, but you can see some yellowing discolored trees on the perimeter there. That's also a symptom that something is wrong with those trees. If we look a little closer and with the light a little bit better, sort of front lit, we can see some dead skeleton trees. And again, we can see some trees that are showing some discoloration, some yellow. This is a good symptom of oak wilt, or it could be some other thing happening. If we look a little closer down on the ground now, looking at these trees, we can see two oak trees here, one that's lost a lot of its leaves and one that's losing its leaves. It's really uncommon to see, or very rare to see oak trees that have lost their leaves in the middle of the summer. This could be June, July, August. And if you're familiar with oak, you usually know that you may know that they usually hang on to their leaves late into the season. It's one of the last trees that lose their leaves. And seeing them brown or discolored in the summer months is very rare, and usually means that there's something wrong with the root system, something wrong with the tree. If we look at closer to the ground of those trees that are losing their leaves, we'll see them on the ground. And of course, that is really odd to see any time during the summer, oak leaves on the ground. There are a few instances where you might see a few on the ground from an insect issue, but when you see lots on the ground like this, it usually is a good sign that something is wrong with that tree. If we look a little closer at those leaves on the ground, we might see something like this. Now, this photo is a pretty well used one across nationally, internationally with oak wilt, and it shows a couple of really good symptoms on this leaf. The first one is you can see the bronze discoloration, often called water soaked or bronze in color, turning brown. And the leaves usually turn brown from the distal end, from the tip of the leaf down, and from the leaf margins in. And you can see that on this example pretty nicely. Another distinctive feature that you can see is the discoloration between the green. It's very distinct between the live material and the dead material. It's almost like there's a fine line between those materials, and you can see them quite distinctly. Something that's a bit odd with this leaf, and I don't particularly like, and no leaf ever looks the same when you're looking at a disease, is a red discoloration in the center. That's not usually typical of oak wilt disease. You might see some red discoloration on these, but normally when you look at these leaves, it's usually a bronze, tawny color with, again, the distinction between the midrib, I should say the midrib, but between the live material and the necrotic or dead material of the leaf. Usually from the distal end, again, the tip of the leaf working its way down. I throw this photo in of showing many leaves discoloration because often when we're looking for oak wilt in Ontario or even in other areas where it's not common, it can often be confused with some other diseases, but the leaves aren't always characteristic to one photo that you might find in the book or the internet. They're extremely variable. But again, the key features are the dying from the tip back, the nice distinct between the green live material and the dead material, and the lack of curling in many cases. The leaves are just really dried out, dead from the tips and from the margins. A lookalike disease that people often make mistakes with, and we've seen in Ontario with people calling in or asking Forest Health, the Ontario Forest Health people, or CFS, or CFIA, Canadian Food Inspection Agency, it's often usually dogwood anthracnose. And dogwood anthracnose can look, or to the untrained eye, very much like oak wilt, but dogwood anthracnose is a disease of usually high, cool, or high humidity weather. It usually occurs in the lower part of the crown, as you can see in the graph or the diagram below on the right. And if we have wet, cool weather in the spring, or sometimes even in the summer, high humidity, those leaves begin to curl, change color, and they can sometimes be mistaken, or they often are mistaken, for oak wilt. But anthracnose is a very, very common disease of many species of tree, and it's very common in oak. If we look at the oak wilt on the left-hand side, we can see the leaves are not really curled, they're brown, discolored, and that usually occurs on the upper part of the crown of the tree and works its way down. So this is a vascular wilt disease, and usually trees start to show or express the disease in the upper part of the crown and work its way down. So what species are affected by oak wilt? Well, all red oak species are affected. So that's the red oak, black oak, Shumard oak. Anything that usually has pointy leaves that's an oak is affected. And the white oak group showing on the left is affected. So red oak is extremely susceptible. 1 or 2 weeks and the tree could be dead, reported in the States in some locations down in Pennsylvania. But most of the time it dies within a year of being infected. The white oak are much more tolerant, resistant. They do become infected, but they often don't express the disease. It's usually done by branch, and it can take years for the trees to die. And in the middle, we see a bur oak reported to be somewhat in between, intermediate of the white oak group. And you read that and you hear about that in the literature, but there is a forester down in the States, actually a pathologist, and it's down in Indiana, who claims that his bur oaks are dying very rapidly. So these things can be quite variable depending on maybe where you are. If we look where red oak is found in Ontario with this map, we can see that the range is quite extensive. The red oak and white oak and bur oak group are very similar to the red oak. In fact, this is the widest range of oaks that we have. And if you're looking for white oak, it's found within this range of red oak and bur oak as well. The concentrations of oak, especially red oak, what we're looking at here, you can see it's extremely high in Southern Ontario. And that's really important to us because that's where a lot of the municipalities are. And that's, if you put in Dutch elm disease and you put in the insect issues that we've been having with emerald ash borer, you can see that the pressures on the urban environment with these tree diseases has been extremely high, and of course some insects that are coming in nowadays. So if we were to lose those oaks in Southern Ontario, that would be a real concern. The forest industry is also concerned about oak wilt. About 1% of our growing stock of all the trees that we have growing in Ontario is oak. And that doesn't sound like very much, but extremely important for wildlife, biodiversity, climate change. We really need to keep these species on the landscape, and we really need to keep them on the landscape in Southern Ontario with the tree species that we're losing from other invasives. Most of the invasive species on that list that I showed you earlier are happening down in Southern Ontario. There's only a few that are actually found in Northern Ontario. Let's just look a little bit at the disease cycle of this pest. And it's spread by really 2 ways. We have overland spread, the upper part of this figure, and by root graft spread underground, showing in the lower part. I want to start off looking at the healthy tree that we see at the top of the graph and spend a little bit of time on here. This is a healthy tree. Let's just pretend it's been wounded by construction damage, or somebody has pruned it early in the season, in say early June, or it's had some broken branch for some reason. And if it becomes infected, and let's just say it has become infected, it will start to express its leaves changing color very quickly, as we talked about. And you'll see the leaves dying in the upper part of the crown of the tree, changing color as we just described, and a lot of them on the ground. The tree will die from the top down, usually, or from the sides where it's become infected, and work its way down very quickly. And I mentioned in red oak in the States, in some locations, up to 2 weeks for mortality, but mostly taking a year to decline and die. If we look at the branch, if we took a small branch about 1 centimeter in diameter up to about 3 centimeters and cut it on a 45-degree angle, we might find some vascular staining in that material. And that's very characteristic for some of the oaks to see that staining, not in all, and we may not see it all the time. If you're familiar with Dutch elm disease, it's very, very similar to the discoloration you'll see when you're looking at Dutch elm disease. And at the bottom here, we have a dead tree. So this tree was alive, say in July, and by the fall, it looks dead. There's no leaves and it's lost its leaves, so you can't really tell anyhow. But underneath that bark, what's happening in late fall and over the winter and into the spring especially, the mycelium is growing, the fungus is growing underneath, and it's producing these pads, often called pressure pads. And this mycelium will grow very, very thick rapidly, and it will put pressure on the bark. Usually these pads can be 1 or 2 centimeters in thickness, and it cracks the bark. And underneath that cracking of the bark, this fungus is sporulating, and it produces a very nice fruit, juicy fruit smell. If you're familiar with juicy fruit chewing gum, it's often the example that people use. But it smells like rotting fruit, very fresh, very nice. And if you're in a forest that has lots of these pressure pads or trees with oak wilt, you can smell it some distance away as you're walking through. And what it's doing is it's producing spores. And when it's producing those spores and emitting this fruity smell, it's attracting these sap beetles. These beetles are often called picnic beetles or sap beetles. And they like to go in and are attracted to the smell, and they rub their bodies, eat some of these spores. And when they become covered with these spores, they're then attracted to other trees that have broken branches or damage done to them, either by pruning, construction, whatever it takes to break a branch. They're attracted to the smell and the sap of that freshly broken branch. And that's how this disease is spread over land. So you have these beetles that are carrying the spores, and they're looking for fresh trees to feed on the sap. Now, this disease is very similar to Dutch elm disease, except these sap beetles are attracted to sap, where Dutch elm bark beetles are bark beetles, and they can chew the bark and do damage to the bark to allow the spores get in. So if we look down below, we have this dead tree. And since it's infected, it has the fungus through its vascular tissue. It's actually connected to the root system, and it will infect trees that are healthy next to it. So an infected tree can, through its root system, the spores can travel, the fungus can travel into a healthy tree and spread that from tree to tree. And normally, it's been reported in the literature about 90% of the infection spread is through root grafts from root to root trees. So here we have a tree that's infecting a healthy tree. So this once healthy tree is now infected. It's going to die. It's going to produce these pressure pads, and then the beetles can come in and continue to spread this cycle. So that's how the disease actually spreads. So overland spread and by root to root spread. Just looking at some of those twigs, if we cut them on a 45-degree angle, we can see some of the staining, the vascular tissue here. And if you just scrape off the bark very lightly with a knife, you might see the staining. It doesn't happen on all tree species or all the oak species, and you may not see it on an infected one. And that's often why people, when they're looking for this, if they're not seeing the staining, it doesn't necessarily mean that the tree is not infected. Here's another example where the staining is a little bit different in color. It's a little bit darker. Here it's a little bit browner. And that's why you really have to see this in person often, or have the experience of looking to see what this discoloration is. If we look at for the pressure cracks, here we have a bowl of a tree with, you can possibly make out a crack right down the center of this tree here. And if we were to remove that bark, and here we're just cutting around with an axe. And if you're familiar with oak, it holds onto its bark very, very firmly. It's extremely difficult to remove the bark, even when the tree is dead. But here we have a crack, and we're going to remove the bark here to see what we find underneath. On the right, we see two structures. These are the pressure pads, the mycelium mats. This is the fungus that's growing very, very vigorously, and it's about 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters thick. It's caused that crack that would have been right down the center here. And this fungus initially is usually white in color when it's fresh, turning a tawny gray. I think it's sort of like a mouse colored skin gray, and eventually turning, staining the wood black and leaving a little white stain. And this is typically what you would see if you were to remove the bark in the spring, if the pressure pads are there. And here you can see that there's two side by side. And this black staining over here is a really good indication, a good sign that you probably had oak wilt disease. And at one time when we were working with Michigan, we were able to determine that this was indeed. So even when this stain disintegrated to just a black spot, we were able to, by molecular means, determine that this tree was indeed infected. If we look at another infected tree, we can see a pressure pad. And if you look closely, when they're very young, it looks kind of brain-like brain-like material, lots of invagulations and very kind of neat looking when it's fresh. And you can see the whiteness still remaining. This is a knife on the side to give you some kind of size reference, but they can be quite large or they can be quite small. Here's another one with the remnants of about 3 pads and the black staining that you could see, removing the bark. And I find that when you're looking at these, they're often look at them at the pole of the tree, because that's where it's easiest to remove the bark and check for them when you're walking through a stand of trees if you're in a forest situation. But it's really difficult to remove the bark on people's trees if they only have one tree in their front yard in an urban setting. And often the tree can have multiple, in fact, hundreds of these pads on them if you remove the bark. Now, the reason I put this photo in here is you can see the remnants of this pad, but you'll often see these insect galleries in here too. And that's often caused by other insects. And one of the big ones that comes into trees that are recently dead or are dying is a two-line chestnut borer. And that insect can often be confused for oak wilt because the tree has died for some reason or is dying, and you find two-line chestnut borer in it. Doesn't necessarily mean that that tree has an oak wilt. But if it does have oak wilt, you'll probably find both the two-line chestnut borer shortly after or during or even before the oak wilt pressure pads form. And I find that looking at pressure pads is really important because it takes a bit of an eye to find them. And once you see a couple of them, you know what they look like and you feel quite comfortable in identifying them. Here we have a piece of bark removed from where a pressure pad was. You can see the remnants of the pad there. And here are the picnic beetles that have been attracted. And if you remove the bark and you see these, and you're familiar with what these beetles look like, which you would be if you looked at enough of them, that's what the beetles, where they are and what they look like. So they hang around as long as the pressure pads are there. This is a photo of 3 species of nectuidid beetles, but in the United States, there's reported to be about 92 species. They're not all found on oak trees. There's only about 3 or 4 species that have been found on oak or associated with oak trees. But a lot of these picnic beetles, sap beetles, are associated with horticultural crops, agricultural crops. So there's lots of these species, and they're native, they're natural, and they're doing their own business. But when they're associated with oak wilt, they actually just transport the spores. So they're one of the vectors of moving this fungus around. They're not bad guys, but they're often associated with the movement. Here we see a photo of root grafting. So this is what's happening below the ground. And root grafting, as I mentioned, is about 90% of the spread of oak wilt. So if you get a park that has oak wilt or a forest situation, it can spread very quickly through root grafts. That's where 90% comes from. Root grafts usually occur between like species. So red oak will root graft with red oak and white oak with white oak. But they do sometimes graft together. It's not that rare. So a white oak could root graft with a red oak and then spread the disease. So looking at root grafts and disrupting root grafts, as we'll see in a little bit, it's really important to try to slow the spread or stop the spread of this disease. So here we are back at this photo of a pocket, and I'm going to say that this pocket's, I'm estimating it's probably about 4 years old. We see a bunch of skeleton trees along the edge of this field here that are whitish in color. We see some discolored trees in the center here that are pinkish, purplish, depending on what you see on your screen. And again, we have these yellow outlier trees here. So this photo was taken sometime in the summer, obviously, when the trees are out. And I'm going to suggest that possibly the infection point was somewhere along the edge of this field, and concentrically, this thing over a period of 2 to 3 years killed these trees in the center. These yellow trees are the advancing front of the disease, and it's being spread by root to root spread. So these trees here are probably all died from 1 or 2 infections that occurred somewhere along here. This tree here, and possibly this one here, could be root graft. Root grafts can move fairly quickly, or it could be a broken branch or something was on this tree, and it could be an overland infection. A beetle that was here, landed here, and started to take this tree out. If you look in the center here, you'll see some green trees, and those green trees could be, or possibly, species that are other than oak. So they might be some other species, not oak, or they could be white oak trees that are not yet infected. So this is what a typical pocket would look like, and this is how fast these this underground spread can take place. It's a sad story of a Michigan tree property owner I just want to share with you. It was kind of an interesting story to learn from Michigan. This is a property owner that bought some oak firewood. He has an oak property, as you can see in the back. And a year after he bought his firewood, he had 2 trees die in his backyard, and he didn't think too much of it. He was a little disappointed. He just had those trees removed. He says, okay, I just have some more firewood from those 2 dead trees. But the year later, this is what he had. So this is 2 years after him buying that firewood, or 2 or 3 years afterwards. He finally called in the Department of Natural Resources, to Michigan Department of DNR, to look at his property, to see what's going on. And they said, oh yeah, you have oak wilt, and too bad you bought that firewood. This is what the property looked like then, and I'm told that there's been a lot more trees removed. So just in a short period of time, this homeowner lost quite a few trees. So where is oak wilt found in North America, or at least across the states? Well, it's not yet in Canada, as far as we know. And this figure shows where oak wilt is found in the United States. The yellow is the biological range and where it's been reported and found. The red indications are new finds in about 2018. But there's 3 things I really want to share with you with this map. First of all, to see how far widespread this is. And it was believed that it came into Wisconsin in 1944, actually was found and identified in 1944, but we know it's been around a lot longer. And when I said found and identified, that's when they first gave it its name. And its name has changed a little bit over the years. At first it was called a ceratocystis disease, because I thought it was very closely associated with Dutch elm disease. And only later it became Redsiella, the genus, when they said there were some differences that differentiated it from Dutch elm disease. But look how widespread this is. So a lot of damage is happening in Texas. And of course, they depend on air conditioning and with these big oak trees and high value trees. But the important points are, look at where these yellow infection points are that are far away from the core center here. Long Island, New York, and New York. That you have to ask yourself, how did they get there so far away? And it's probably by the movement of firewood or the movement of logs with the bark still attached. So this disease is extremely slow moving normally, but the movement of firewood can really send it, or movement of firewood or logs with bark on it can really make it move quicker and show up in other places. So normally it's been very slow moving, and control has been quite good in some aspects, but once it moves into an area, it can be very difficult to control. And I want to emphasize that this area here of upstate New York. This area near Saratoga Springs, the horse racing track area, had an infection in 2008, was the first time they found it. And New York State thought they did a really good job of eradicating it at the time. They spent a lot of money and energy, and they've really become up to date on oak wilt. But in 2014, so 2008, they found it. 2014, it sort of reoccurred in that area, and they thought they were addressing it again. And then just recently in 2018 and 2019, it's sort of really spread. This area down here, which is the Finger Lakes area, which is also called Ontario County. So not in Ontario, but Ontario County up in New York, near the Finger Lakes. They've had an infection there that's really caused some concern. So once it gets into an area, it can really take hold. And I always say, once you get it, it's really hard to get rid of it unless you're really on the ball, which takes lots of resources and lots of detection and lots of skill. And a lot of these fungi, like all the other fungi, are cryptic. They're really hard to see, really hard to find. And most of the time, we're not very successful at dealing with them. And look at that list that I provided at the beginning. So what are some of the impacts? Well, you already know that the trees die very quickly, at least the red oak species. But Canadian Forest Service, CFS, Dan McKenney's work out of Sault Ste. Marie, tried to model how much mortality we could expect to see with oak wilt disease. And he built this model on the emerald ash borer model that they were working on. So emerald ash borer came in with a bang and killed lots of trees. And then Dan says, well, maybe I could turn around and use this model. So what they did is they tried to estimate the total number of susceptible trees within 10 meters of road edges. And they used Google Earth kind of maps and things, and they used materials that they had, tree surveys and inventories that municipalities had to try to get an idea of how many trees they might be dealing with. And then they put some random numbers on, I shouldn't say random, but estimates of tree removal costs anywhere from $150 to $2,000, and what the replacement cost of those trees would be if they had to replace those trees. And then they made some general assumptions, assuming that 50% of homeowners would replace the trees that they lost, which I think is a pretty high estimate. But anyways, the values that he came up with rough, and I should say that this is work in progress. It's a year old, what I'm presenting here now, but I know that they're still working on this material. So what they came up with is an estimated regional value for Eastern Canada was about $600 million, for Ontario, 385 million. And for the town of Windsor, where it's very close, it's only 500 meters away down in Windsor, Detroit area, was about $7 million. And of course, when he tried to look at what the frequency of total city costs across the landscape would be, he came up with these values here. So I would just say, looking at the last value here, there's 18 municipalities or cities that he came up with that would cost over $5 million for a one-time removal and replacement of those trees. Well, these diseases don't work in one-time removals. You'll be dealing with this forever if we have it, just like emerald ash borer or Dutch elm disease. In fact, in some of these diseases we've given up with, Dutch elm disease, we've pretty well given up doing anything within our municipalities. There's very few that actually have a program to deal with Dutch elm disease. And oak wilt, you can see what the losses are. So just using Dan McKinney's model of what these costs are, I like to think of what it would mean to a municipality like Windsor that's got its normal city budget dealing with X, Y, and Z, and all of a sudden they come up with that they have to spend $7.5 million to deal with trees that rapidly die. So oak wilt is really going to have an impact on our municipalities and our environment. It's going to have an impact on us. And often we don't see this until we're addressing it, and we have time to address it now. So what are some of the prevention and management things that we can do? Well, they're actually quite easy, quite simple, and I think quite effective. The first thing is don't prune or don't harvest, prune, or otherwise harm oak trees from bud swell up to 2 to 3 weeks after full leaf development. So that's when the bud is developing on the tree in the spring to when they're fully leafed out sometime in late June, maybe even into July, depending on the phenology when the leaves come out where you are, especially in Canada where we're such a wide difference in Southern Ontario temperatures to Northern Ontario temperatures. If the reason why that works, if you remember that diagram that we were dealing with, if we're not causing sap to run in the trees when those sap beetles are out, then they can't become infected. So the only way a tree can become infected if they're, first of all, we have the disease in the area, and then we have the beetle. We have the sap beetles, they're native, they're found everywhere. But if we have the fungus, the spores of the fungus, and the beetles are transporting them to trees, and then we're not pruning those trees when they're developing their leaves, then we can protect ourselves quite a bit. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And of course, the other aspect is not move infected firewood around with the bark still attached. And there's a real issue with moving firewood around. That's a really big one. We shouldn't be moving firewood around, not just for oak wilt disease, but for every species, even if we don't have a problem yet. There's so many on the horizon, and there's so many diseases that have been spread by firewood. If you remember my first slide, infected trees and firewood movement is the way that most of these invasive pathogens and insects move around. If you're traveling in the States, you might see a billboard like this. This is one for Minnesota, but many states have these kinds of billboards. Prevent oak wilt, don't prune in May or June. That's when they determine that their phenology of their leaves coming out and developing is May and June. And it's pretty effective if you're not pruning at that time to slow the spread or even stop the spread of your particular tree becoming infected. Now, this has caused some controversy in some states because it really depends on the phenology when your trees are starting to leaf out. And of course, some people will say, well, does it infect a tree if I prune it in the fall? So a lot of research is being done, and some of that research in Ontario is being done by Sharon Reed, who's going to be presenting a little bit later. And I'm sure she's going to talk about, she is going to talk about this. But when are these beetles flying, and are they carrying spores all year round? And should we be worried all the time? And I think those are good and important questions we need to have answered when we're developing policy on what to do in Ontario or anywhere else for that matter. But the premise of not pruning when the trees are leafing out, or pruning your trees at all if you don't have to during the growing season, is an important one, because if you don't have a wound on your tree that's producing sap, then a beetle won't be attracted to it. So if you can prune your trees in the winter time or some other time, then you don't have to worry too much about this disease getting your tree. What are some control mechanisms? Well, I mentioned that most of the spread is 90% through the root systems, and that's where we're going to see large increase in oak wilt happening. And they've come up with this kind of machinery, a reciprocating blade that's 5.5, 6 feet long. It's a blade they stick in the ground, and they drive around between infected and uninfected trees. So between trees that have the disease and trees that don't. And there's some determination of what that distance should be. I'm not going to go into detail here, but here we can see that reciprocating blade in soil. This is in Michigan. It does very little damage in sandy soil. It works very, very well. And basically what happens is when you have an infected area, you go in and you trench the area. So it severs the roots between healthy trees and live trees on one side. And I mentioned that this is a very virulent pathogen, meaning it kills trees quickly, but it's a fairly weak fungus. It's colonized by other fungi very quickly. And when we're taking samples, those branch samples and things, they have to be put in coolers, shipped very quickly. And if they're not, they're colonized by other fungi, opportunistic fungi, very quickly. The other thing with this trenching is the trees that are infected still have to be removed, cut, stumps treated or pulled out of the ground to stop, not so much the underground spread for sure by this root severing, but to stop the insects from producing pressure, or I shouldn't say insects, sorry, pressure pads from forming on those trees that you leave on the other side, the side that's been infected. So those trees that are infected have to be removed as well. So this is very expensive treatment. I mentioned Texas was big on oak wilt, and it's a real issue down there too. And everything is big in Texas, as they say. This is a rock saw. Texas has lots of limestone and rock outcrops, and the roots of oak grow through these crevices in these rocks. And of course, they have to be severed. And this large reciprocating blade, very expensive to do per line, per foot. Very effective, apparently, but expensive. And I worry about this oak wilt disease coming to Canada on the shield. It's fine to use those reciprocating blades when you're down in southern Ontario on sandy soils and Leamington and areas like such. But when you get up to the shield here in the Ottawa Valley area, you have rock outcrops, it's going to be expensive dealing with this. This is upstate New York and on a high value property. And another way of trenching is to use a backhoe. And in this case, they're putting in a little bit more permanent barrier, a rubber barrier to stop that infection from traveling. Very expensive. I couldn't do this in the forest industry side. And even root trenching on the forest industry side would be very expensive. Chemical control is another way of treating this disease. This is propiconazole, as a registered, very deadly fungicide in the States, very toxic. It's under the trade name Alamo in the States, not registered yet in Canada. In fact, we don't have a project registered in Canada. Propiconazole or chemical controls won't stop the disease. They're a preventative measure. They help the tree or prevent the tree from getting the disease. But if a tree is infected, it won't help the tree. And if it's spreading through the root system, it won't stop the spread through the root, from root to root contact. So an important tool to have in a toolbox to deal with this disease. And of course, it's injected and used very much the same way as triazine is used if you're dealing with emerald ash borer. So the same kind of technology, the same technique it's using for Dutch elm disease, but very limited use. If we really had large outbreaks of oak wilt and we're in the situations that people would be in Wisconsin or in Michigan, where they're really slowing the spread and trying to save a few trees, and this works well, but on a landscape level, really difficult. Management strategies in advance of oak wilt. I'm really big on what we can do before we get oak wilt, and I'm repeating myself here, but the most important thing we can do is keep current on the issues and know where the disease advancing front is located. And I say that because the disease advancing front is really the American border right now. And CFIA is doing an excellent job with its phytosanitary certificates and the importation of wood. And I forgot to mention on my slide looking at Quebec, or at the United States and where Quebec is. Quebec imports a great deal of wood. It's the forest industry, I shouldn't say the forest industry, but the manufacturing industry in Quebec and the eastern townships, lots and lots of wood from the southern state, from the south of the border, the northern border, of Canada. So from Vermont, New York, Wisconsin, Minnesota, a lot of oak wood is coming into Quebec to be made into furniture and other hardwood products. And that's a big industry. And our CFIA is really protecting us with regards to their phytosanitary certificates of moving wood. But should the stuff get in, we should know in Ontario or where it is and keep current on the issue and know where the disease advancing front is. And I like to use the example with emerald ash borer. When we had emerald ash borer, and it was first found in southwestern Ontario and it was really populating that area, CFIA people did a workshop in Ottawa. And Ottawa was really far away from where emerald ash borer was found when it was being found in the Toronto and southwestern Ontario area. Within 2 weeks, one of the technicians for the city found the disease. So even though it could be far away from us, it's really important to know where it is and what to do about it. Now, this photo shows some wound spraying, and if we avoided cutting the tree during the active growing season, no problem, no concern for oak wilt. But if you are going to cut trees during active growing season, when the leaves or buds are just about to flush and coming out, and I would say even later in the season, since we really don't know, then applying a latex paint or a tree wound paint or any kind of barrier on the wound would be helpful. Now, this is going against the grain of what urban foresters have been doing for years and arborists have been doing. We no longer recommended for years about putting wound paint or paint on wounds. The reason that we're doing it for oak wilt is simply to stop the smell, the odor of the wound, the sap that would be oozing this odor, attracting bark beetles. If we interfere with that beetle finding that wound, then if it's carrying spores, it's not going to infect that tree. So an individual homeowner can protect itself by covering the wounds if it's pruning its tree, or better still, don't even use wound painting or latex paint or wound paint to cover the branch. Just don't prune your tree during the active growing season. And we could actually have municipalities do that too. In fact, Windsor has changed its management strategies of requiring its line pruning and its city pruning to be done in the wintertime. So it's just a matter of a stroke of a pen with a contract, if you're a municipality, of having your trees pruned in the winter rather than during the active growing season when the trees could potentially attract beetles, which spores. And I throw in the construction ordinances down there because I know a lot of municipalities and people are having problems with people doing construction on their properties, which is really hard to control. But I think if we had better ordinances and if people were aware, private owners aware that they should not be damaging their trees, then I think we better protect ourselves with the disease. So I'm talking about protecting before we get oak wilt into the area. So these are things that we could be doing even if we never got oak wilt disease found in Ontario, to protect yourself. And certainly if we find it, this is something we should be doing more frequently. And with that, I'll end it there. And I think we probably have time for questions.
We do indeed, Richard. Thanks. Great presentation. Really, really good overview and comprehensive. It's interesting. Very interesting. Anyway, yeah, we got several questions here, and folks can again use either the Q&A or the chat. And I'll start with the Q&A. So Richard, I'll just read them to you and you can answer. So from Lindsay, we have a question. What are some tips to identifying pressure pads under the bark? Are there any other identifying features other than the smell and the leaf die-off?
Well, I would say the leaf die-off is a really big one if you're seeing it. And then certainly go look for the pressure pads. And the pressure pads can be hard to find because they often don't appear till the following spring. So if you're seeing leaves falling off your tree this current summer or into the fall, the pressure pads may not fully develop until the current season, the next year. They do often occur during the summer. So if the tree was infected early in the season, you might be able to find them, late summer or into the fall. But the majority of the time we find them the following spring. Looking for them, there's a couple of good videos I'll just mention online that are made that are actually from Michigan. And there's a technique of tapping on the bark, looking for the pressure pads, looking at sounds. It works really, really well. And it's Philip Gujak who does those videos. That's really worthwhile looking at. But no, it's really difficult. And in Ontario, I would say the biggest problem that we have, since we don't have oak wilt, often people are seeing symptoms, often anthracnose, and then being worried about their tree having oak wilt. Now, if you're in question, then you really should contact the CFIA and have somebody look at your tree. But the difficulty is there's lots of people out there and there's lots of issues on oak trees that can be causing problems. So not easy to diagnose right away, no.
Okay. Thanks, Richard. Here's a question from Jenny. Is there a safe distance within which to move firewood? For example, I wouldn't buy firewood from an hour's drive away, but could I take firewood from others in my neighborhood or municipality?
Yeah, I would say it's always a risk taking firewood from anywhere. But yes, the closer you are to your firewood, the better it is. So if you can buy it within your own municipality, do so. Interesting enough, New York State and Wisconsin, New York State has a limit that you can't move firewood more than 50 miles. And one of the reasons they have that, and I like it, I wish we could do something like that in Ontario, it really prevents the long distance movement of some of these pests. So some jurisdictions are actually trying to move forward on that. We're a long way away because of the economics. And if you're familiar with firewood, we have firewood that's coming in from BC, from mountain pine beetle killed wood that's been kiln treated. So if you're buying wood that's kiln treated coming from away, then that's probably fine. But if you really want to avoid the problems on your property, like that Michigan owner, for example, buying wood locally there might have been an issue for him because it's, as you can see, that a county in the States is at least, if there's one find in a county, then the whole county is marked as infected or populated. So my advice, again, just in brief, is if you can buy wood locally, close as possible to your property, the better off you are.
Great, thanks, Richard. Here's a question from Blair. If we cover wounds with paint, spray, tar, etc., are we not just inviting other problems such as rot in the covered area or other insects?
No, I don't think so. In fact, the issue with using tar and those wound paints overall was a problem of causing issues, but in most cases, no, it's really minor compared to what the cost of this disease will be. And if you're really worried about that kind of stuff, I would say, Blair, then the best issue is not to prune during the active growing season, but to prune over the fall and winter months. There's plenty of time to do that. In fact, at a couple of arborist conferences I was at, a lot of arborists said, well, you know, that's where we make our money is pruning in the summertime. And what was interesting afterwards, I had a ton of companies come up and speak to me saying, we like the idea of pruning in the wintertime because it spreads out our season, our work season. So there's a lot of them are saying that they are pruning in the wintertime now just because they like extending their season and keeping their employees working. The other aspect that ties into that, I think, is the spread through power line companies. And there's been some examples down in the States where the disease has cadiddle hopped, moved down a range of a power line when they just went in and pruned the branches back. And of course, power is important. It's you know, we want our homes heated and lit. But if those concessions, those contracts to be issued and possibly done in the winter, then there's no need to use pruning paint or spray paint.
Right on. Thanks, Richard. Just a comment here from Terry. We have oak wilt here in Stratford. So there is some in
yeah, I don't, as far as I know, and Erin can speak to that. Erin with the CFI, and her, she's got a presentation coming on. Maybe Erin wants to jump in, but as far as I know, we have no oak wilt in Ontario, to my knowledge, and that's, I think, pretty current.
Okay.
But maybe.
Well, we'll hear from Erin and Sharon later as well. So
and if people think we do have it, then they should be contacting Erin and reporting it to CFIA for sure.
Right on. And here's a question from Stephen. What effect does driving machinery around in root zones have on the remaining trees?
I'm not sure what he means by that question, remaining trees. So if you're referring to doing the root severing and driving machinery on, I don't think that hurts anything. But if he's referring to the infected trees, driving the machinery on, it's not going to do much damage. It's going to, the fungus will still exist if you drive material over it. You know, once the roots are infected, they're infected, and the question is how long do they stay infected for, which can be a number of years, and that's why the root grafting. And as I mentioned, it's a very strong virulent pathogen, but it's a fairly weak fungus overall. So meaning it's colonized by other fungi. So if you have tree roots that are infected, and the disease can only survive if it has oak trees. So you have no oak trees, no live oak trees, and the fungus can't survive. And other fungi will take over and devour it, put it in other words.
You just clarified with the comment soil compaction. You wondered about that, I guess.
Well, soil compaction in any forest situation is always a concern. But I think when you're dealing with disease with that tractor, they're pretty light, and I don't really see that as personally as an issue. And most of the soils that those machines have been on were sandy soils. I don't quite understand that question with regards to oak wilt, but
yeah, okay. Well, we can circle back if needed. So there's a lot of questions lined up here, but we only have a few more minutes, so we can save some of these for the end, and we'll hopefully eventually get them all answered. But we'll do a couple more. This is from Kendra. What product should be used to treat cut stumps? Latex paint or a fungicide?
yeah, well, not a fungicide, but latex paint would work, or anything that you would use on branches. So tar. When we say latex paint, it could be a cheap leftover paint can that you have. Anything that's going to stop the smell of the insect from finding that freshly cut wound.
Right on.
Even throwing soil over the stump would work.
Okay, perfect. And from Brianna, you mentioned several times not to move firewood with bark attached. Do the pressure pads not form on bare wood?
Yeah, that's a good question. The pressure pads do form on bare wood, and they're right against the xylem. It's on the vascular tissue. So you know, the literature and a lot of people deem that if you cover the wood, or if you remove the bark and it dries out, and of course you remove the pressure pad, then the odor isn't there and the insects aren't attracted to the fungus anymore. But you know, it's a slippery slope when you say just remove the bark, and if who knows if there's still beetles attached. But yeah, it's the insects aren't usually attracted to the wood unless the fungus is there and it's sap. So if the wood is dry, then not really an issue. It's a fuzzy one.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Can an infected tree overcome the pathogen, or is it always fatal? And that's from John.
Right. Well, it's reported that some white oak trees can sometimes overcome the infection through tylosis. It can wall it off and slow it down. But I don't know of any research that says trees actually recover from it. So with white oak, for example, it's a very slow process that can take sometimes 5, 6, 7 years before the tree actually dies. So, you know, what I just said, I don't think there's any real resistance to a tree once it gets it. It's just a slow process in killing it.
Right on. And we'll take one last question, and I'll defer the remainder. There's quite a few, but we need to get on to the next presentation. And this is from Jack for you, Richard. Where did this come from? For example, another invasive species. Where did it originate?
Yeah, it's unknown where it actually came from. It was found in Wisconsin and identified as the fungus. So when I say found and identified, they actually gave it its name in 1944 in Wisconsin. But there is evidence that the disease was around back in the 1920s. And initially people thought it might be a native pathogen that just became more virulent. So something that was always present, but it didn't do a lot of damage until it, you know, got a stronger strain, just like the viruses that we're dealing with nowadays. But some people think it is an invasive species, and we determine it to be an invasive species now. And I think we say it's an invasive because we don't know what the origin is. Certainly in Canada, we can say it's invasive because we've never had it. The states are saying it's invasive, but you know, maybe it is you know, a native that's become more virulent. But the general thinking of pathologists, it's an invasive pathogen, uncertain of its origin, just like butternut canker, uncertain of its origin.
Right on. Well, thanks, Richard. great presentation again, and good answers to the questions. Like I say, there's quite a number more, but we'll get on to the next presentation, and we can hopefully save those for the end. If not, we'll find a way to answer them and distribute them with the survey, the answers to those questions with the survey that's going out after this. And just a reminder, this is being recorded, so you can go back and look at it again or share it with your friends and family. So all good. Thanks again, Richard.
Welcome.
Stick around, of course. So I'm going to invite our next panelist to make her presentation. And it's Erin Bullis Appleton, and with the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and it's a bit of an update with surveys, policy, and actions. So I'll turn it over to you, Erin. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here today and have this opportunity to provide you with an update. Richard provided a great starting point and background for us, and I hope to share some background as far as legislative authority that the CFI has to prevent the entry of oak wilt, as well as the supporting oak wilt regulations. Preparedness, so looking at ways in which we engage communities, develop response frameworks, and work with partners to prepare for oak wilt in Canada. And then I will highlight some of our surveillance activities, including the methodology employed this year, our sample analysis techniques, and where we're at. So just a refresher on our mandate, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency aims to mitigate risk to Canada's plant resource base, which is integral to a safe and accessible food supply, as well as to public health and environmental sustainability. So now looking at ways in which we have strived to prevent oak wilt introduction to Canada. The Plant Protection Act forms the foundation to protect plant life and the agricultural and forestry sectors of Canada, by preventing the importation, exportation, and spread of pests, and by controlling or eradicating pests in Canada. Oak wilt is a regulated pest for Canada, with a number of commodities regulated to prevent movement of infected material. So both propagative and non-propagative material, including nursery stock, logs with bark attached, branches and wreaths, including foliage, and large branches, 1.5 centimeters in diameter, bark, pulpwood, firewood, as well as other potentially susceptible species. As Richard alluded to, oak wilt was first described in Wisconsin in 1942, and we do have a history of oak wilt prevention in Canada. We know that by the mid-1960s, it was confirmed in mid-central, midwestern, and mid-Atlantic states. And in 1978, we introduced a quarantine circular for the prevention of the introduction of oak wilt disease into Canada, followed by the Plant Health Import Operational Directive for oak wilt in 1987. Our oak wilt policy stipulates phytosanitary measures to prevent the entry of oak wilt disease from the continental United States, and it includes import and phytosanitary requirements for regulated products. It provides guidelines and inspection requirements for facilities importing regulated commodities under special import permits, so Section 43 permits for processing, and also provides for removal, disposal, or treatment of non-compliant product. So there were some recent policy updates in the past couple of years, stipulating high and low risk periods. So the high risk period includes April to July 31st, as Richard highlighted, when environmental and biological conditions are conducive to above ground spread of oak wilt via the insect vectors that Sharon will tell us all about soon. During this period, regulated articles must be processed within 30 days of importation. During the low risk period, when environmental and biological conditions are less conducive to above ground spread, during August 1st to March 31st, regulated articles must be processed before April 1st to mitigate the risks. We do have this supported by the approved Canadian Processing Facility Preventative Control Plan, and we have monitoring requirements for regulated articles in the red oak group. So indicating that a complete inspection must be conducted throughout processing, CFI must be notified of all signs of oak wilt if found, and non-compliant regulated articles must be disposed of or processed within a maximum of 24 hours of detection. So this highlights that we really do have some great industry-based prevention strategies with solid partnerships with our industry leaders. CFI does issue import permits, which are required for import of oak logs from the US. And as noted, importers implement a number of control measures to mitigate the risk, including inspection of logs, debarking, waste disposal, segregation of material based on origin, surveillance around the facility for oak wilt symptoms. And we're seeing how successful and effective this is, as suspect logs have been reported to CFIA for sample collection, and mitigation measures were immediately implemented. And we know it's successful because we have been notified. However, CFI has not yet detected oak wilt on any imported logs. Furthermore, importers are participating in research projects in collaboration with NRCan, CFIA, and some of the work Sharon's doing on the vector insect trapping and detection. So we're working to prepare for oak wilt incursions with our partners and looking at ways in which we can respond accordingly. So we know the threat is real. A number of pockets of infestation are in close proximity to the Ontario and Canadian border. We know that pretty much all provinces in Eastern Canada are at risk. And so one way in which we support preparedness and response is through community engagement. So working closely with partners like the Invasive Species Center and others to highlight key symptomology during the optimal detection periods to ensure that people know how to recognize oak wilt and furthermore know how to report it under the authority of the Plant Protection Act. More recently, we've also been striving to integrate artificial intelligence into our response and preparedness planning. In recent years, we see that the community science apps that a number of people are using, such as iNaturalist and EdMaps, are incredibly useful, and there's been a tremendous increase in reports over time. We recognize that the data generated in these apps is highly valuable, and variable, with new and significant detections being made. We also recognize, however, that some of these apps allow for real-time reporting in the public domain, and thus our trade partners could be aware of findings before we are. So for that reason, the Plant Health Surveillance Unit has been working with our Artificial Intelligence Lab to mine data in these platforms and alert scientists when reports of regulatory significance are noted. So you can see many of the reports in the US in an app like iNaturalist. And then below here, this is the spreadsheet that we each get on a daily basis, highlighting new detections that we can follow up on and garner some additional information to respond to and conduct site visits at. Furthermore, we work with the Invasive Species Center and Scouts Canada this past year on the Tree Check campaign. And this community science initiative allowed us do targeted awareness and promotion on priority pests, including oak wilt. And it not only provided some baseline data on urban and natural forest canopies, however, it did highlight some suspect pest issues that we can work with our partners to follow up on over the coming months. But overall, the Invasive Species Center has been integral in analyzing this data and providing a report so we can assess it in-house and determine what warrants follow-up. Some of you may be aware that in 2019, insect samples were collected from traps along the Ontario border, which tested positive for the oak wilt pathogen. So this is primarily to highlight that research is really supporting early warning systems. These don't constitute regulatory fines or incursions. However, they do alert us to key areas at risk and help inform strategic surveillance. Our colleague at the CFIA lab, a research scientist, Guillaume Bilodeau, has been working with Philippe Tanguay, Sharon Reed, and others from Canadian Forest Service and Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources, as well as industry partners, on some detection work for oak wilt, eDNA, and insect traps, and that was the work I just highlighted in the last slide. However, there is a goal to continue to enhance our confidence in our sampling methodology to ensure that detection of oak wilt is occurring if it's present in a tree. So some of our constraints still continue to be how to assess a tree and sample it accordingly, and which samples will give you positive results. So Richard showed you those cross-sectional staining, and that's really important. So how can we get better at strategically selecting the appropriate material from our trees for lab submission? So a proposed research project that is under development is to validate and compare 2 portable tools for detection of oak wilt pathogen on site. So looking at different PCR and CRISPR-based in situ detection as a tool for pre-screening in the field. So helping us alert more to highly symptomatic or suspect trees that we can then assess in more detail in the lab environment. We also support ongoing outreach and awareness through strategic distribution of products. We have our oak wilt pest cards. We also have our product development with the Invasive Species Center, so some collective fact sheets that can be applied for multiple uses and networks. We also have worked on consistent messaging. So when we need to communicate things to the public to enhance surveillance capacity and promote early detection, we work together to do so. So we have complementary and coordinated messaging. Training and education is really important. We've had to adapt this over time. You see us all in this room a couple years ago when we used to get together face to face, and now we're effectively evolving our strategy to ensure we maintain this type of education and common learning framework to help continue to build our networks and improve collaborations. Collaborative oak wilt training really is the key to these preemptive and proactive measures, because years ago when we started this, we were all kind of learning together, and since then a number of municipalities and jurisdictions have proactively employed risk mitigation measures. So it's really effective as far as prevention and awareness. It enhances our surveillance capacity and allows us to really get the word out as a collective. Furthermore, we've been supporting preparedness through our Oak Wilt Technical Advisory Committee. Although we haven't met in some time, we still continue to coordinate information sharing, facilitate and support research advancements, and work together on outreach, education, and communication towards increasing awareness. We continue to liaise with experts like we're doing today and other science or advisory bodies, and provide case-specific recommendations if and when we detect oak wilt in Canada. This is a really effective way to maintain ongoing knowledge transfer. Informal information exchanges allow us to consult with US colleagues, even conduct site visits in infected areas, and garner insight and advice based on best practices that some of our partners have implemented, sharing lessons learned to help feed into our method development. Furthermore, it just builds our network and allows for more real-time updates on advancements in the field of oak wilt. So out of this group, we successfully completed an oak wilt response framework for Canada to identify key partners and stakeholders, outreach and education strategies, looking at the significance and implications of oak wilt, and articulating host dispersal methods and regulatory tools that can be used. This response framework provides what may be done, but not necessarily what will be done, and also helps us to build our research information. So if and when oak wilt were to be detected in Canada, there'd be a number of considerations to be taken into account. And as Richard mentioned, control options are a big one as far as what tools we have in our toolkit. The detection scenario will also dictate what is done. Is it a localized infection, or are there many pockets of infection across a given area? And so that extent of the infestation will build into the decision framework that will either move towards active control, including tree removals and disposal, or more passive control, which would be the establishment of regulated areas, maintaining issuing regulatory documents, maintaining surveys, and public outreach. So as far as our CFI surveillance program, we continue to enhance our surveys for oak wilt over time, building in more sites in key areas at risk and strategically assessing those areas in close proximity to US infestations, as well as campgrounds, mills, and facilities importing oak logs. Border crossings, especially those with firewood disposal bins, are very important. And we also look at historical weather events because, as we know, tree breakage and wind events can be important as far as attracting vectors and that vector-borne spread. At each of these locations, we visually inspect 50 red oak trees in the forest stand and conduct a stand level assessment for pockets of dead or declining trees. So you can see 67 sites were delivered across Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick. So as we continue to expand the survey, we have looked more extensively moving into New Brunswick and other areas of Quebec. So our survey method, we endeavor to distribute our survey activities evenly among each of the site types, focusing on areas with oak surrounding those site types. And our inspection radius, we try to cover a 500-meter radius to ensure that we're getting a good component of that oak stand. If no oaks are found, then we continue to search and locate sites within 3 to 5 kilometers of that high-risk location. In some cases, our staff use binoculars to assess mature trees, and if symptomatic branches occur higher in the canopy, pole pruners can be used to remove samples, and then wounds are treated with spray paint during the high-risk period. In some cases, to create operational efficiencies, we may GPS mark a number of symptomatic trees that staff will return to and conduct sampling events on following the high-risk period. So when we look for oak wilt, we assess trees for all those signs and symptoms noted by Richard, the discolored leaves with that distinct margin, early leaf drop. So our survey aligns to that period when we would know early leaf drop most significantly. So from mid-July to late August, we look for flagging and thinning crowns, the dark fungal mats on dead or recently dead trees. And when we see symptomatic material, so cueing into those leaf symptoms, we want to see that sapwood staining and discoloration on the wood itself. And as Richard noted, we do also use all our senses and cue into that fruity fermented smell that can be indicative of oak wilt. So it's important to highlight that when we respond to suspect reports, we do so as a collective, being stronger with the support of our partners. In some cases, we receive suspect reports from our partners and we respond to them together or collaboratively. In other cases, we respond to reports from the general public, in which we enlist our partners for potential support if it involves municipal trees that need to be sampled, or if we simply don't have in-house arborist support, we may look to our partners to help with some of these sampling events. So if and when oak wilt were to be detected in Canada, delimitation surveys would be warranted. So we'd need to determine the extent of the infestation by visually surveying all oaks radiating out 100 meters beyond the periphery of the infestation. So Richard showed you that really prominent pocket. So we'd move out there to try and find the outer boundary of infestation represented by trees exhibiting new symptoms of infection or recently dead trees. Concurrent to this, we would conduct traceback investigation activities to identify additional high-risk locations if there's potential for firewood or movement of infected host material to other locations. Sample collection, we focus on branch samples, although leaf samples cue us into symptomology. Our diagnostic focus is branch samples. So we select and remove 3 branches with discolored leaves. Also can sample for compression mats on dead trees, creating a bark window and removing strips of discolored sapwood tissue from the outer growth rings. Our lab begins the analysis process by culturing with selective media for oak wilt to inhibit other groups. It does require a viable infection, and samples therefore are handled aseptically with sterilized tools and equipment because oak wilt is such a poor competitor. The exterior tissue is removed to allow access to the fresh, actively growing infections. And this is then plated into agar or placed in a moist chamber. The samples are checked under a microscope for fungal structures after 10 days. Concurrent to that, our lab conducts PCR analysis. The assays are challenged against a broad list of organisms expected to inhabit the same ecosystem to confirm specificity. So it's really important that our inspectors tell our lab the full story through the lab submission process. So providing intelligence on the tree symptoms that were noted, condition of trees in the vicinity, or any other potential biotic or abiotic factors that may be contributing. Suspect samples are then analyzed via sequencing to determine if it is indeed the oak wilt pathogen. So an important point to highlight is that the CFI must be notified of detections that may pose a risk to Canada's plant resource base, in addition to pests regulated by Canada. So any one of us suspecting the presence of a regulated pest, including oak wilt, is obligated under the Plant Protection Act to notify the Canadian Food Inspection Agency so we can work with you to follow up and sample accordingly. It's also notable that we are very open to collaborative surveillance, and we welcome any partners surveying for regulated plant pests to provide us with their data to foster collective reporting, enabling us to depict our collaborative efforts, maximize coverage, and complement one another with our resources and our approach. So a point to note, there's our address for you to share your data, and we'd be happy to include it in our maps. Next steps with respect to oak wilt, we will continue to develop, support, and communicate prevention strategies to partners, stakeholders, and the public. We'll continue to build a network of oak wilt ambassadors with our key partners, providing current tools and resources and raising awareness to facilitate action on oak wilt in various jurisdictions. The CFI will continue oak wilt detection surveys across Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick in 2022, with an effort to track suspects for ongoing monitoring and sharing suspect areas with key partners. We will continue to address ongoing outreach and education training needs with our partners, as well as anyone wishing for oak wilt training in relation to CFI survey activities. We're more than happy to work with you on that as well. So I'd like to thank you for your time and welcome any questions.
Thanks, Erin. Great presentation. And I might have missed it. I was helping someone deal with some technical issues, one of the participants. Have your surveys indicated that there is any oak wilt in Ontario yet? Is it definitive yet?
No, so I'll just go back to this map, and you can see that, sorry, where did you go map? There you are. All the dots are green, indicating that either there was no symptomatic trees or any trees that appeared symptomatic did not test positive for oak wilt. So to date, oak wilt is still not known to occur in Canada.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Excellent. And I did resolve that technical issue. So everyone who wants to participate is in today. Well, that's great. So we've got a few minutes for continued questions. And I'll just read those again. There might be some that you want to defer to Richard. I'm not sure. But we'll just go through them and answer them one by one, and you can decide. We'll get more and more of the panel in on this. So we got one here from Ron. Has there been any eDNA sampling of insects further away from the border?
So that's a great question. We do have an invasive alien species trapping survey, which uses large lingering funnel traps baited with a series of different lures for attraction of longhorn beetles and wood-boring pests. And those traps are wet traps that we place in various high-risk areas, import centers, industrial areas across Canada. In Ontario, we have 20 locations that we alter and rotate over time. We've been doing this survey for a couple of decades at least. But in the last couple of years, we have a partnership with the Biodiversity Institute of Ontario, And we basically ship all the insect specimens to our lab for taxonomic identification by our entomologists. And then the fluid from those traps goes to the Biodiversity Institute for eDNA analysis, next-gen sequencing. And so they're looking for a number of target regulated species. Furthermore, Guillaume Bilodeau has done some work with pathogenic analysis of wet trap samples, and we haven't picked up anything suspect of oak wilt in those to date.
Wow, it's great. I'm always impressed with the rigor of the science around invasive species. You guys do a great job. Okay. Again, someone commented about they think it's in Stratford, and is the CFIA aware of that? So that's just a question that came in there now.
So I would welcome the person reporting oak wilt in Stratford to please reach out to me via any of the email addresses provided today to officially make a report, so we can work with you on a follow-up, have our operations staff conduct a site visit to assess the situation.
Okay, and that was Terry Hoover. So yeah, we'll make sure that that connection is made. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks. That's great. And here's another one. Are we to focus more on oak wilt than on LDD? Both have been around for a significant amount of time. It is understood that this would be under regular conditions, that is no drought. That's from Blair.
Yeah, which one do we focus on, right? I think they all warrant focus for different reasons. You know, it's understood that LDD is causing some major stress to our oaks, and it also makes it more challenging to assess trees for oak wilt leaf symptoms when there are no leaves left. I don't think we can say we should focus on one and not the other. If we have the potential to prevent and mitigate the impacts of one, that's certainly a worthwhile effort. You know, Richard, others feel free to jump in, but I think we need to kind of focus on forest health as a whole and look for ways in which we can promote tree health.
Oh, Richard, you're on mute.
I think it's right that we need to focus on both, but I would say with LDD, old gypsy moth, we do have a number of strategies to deal with that. And we do have a virus and a fungus that work very effectively on that. And we've had that in Canada since 1967, gypsy moth, and it's been under control. So some years it really springs up, and maybe with climate change, we're seeing more. But because we have Mammaphobia magmega, the fungus, and we also have MPV virus that's available in Canada, gypsy moth is not going to kill oak trees dead. If the trees are stressed because of drought, then we're going to see some mortality. But over the long run, oak is still going to survive from gypsy moth. They're still going to be around. Whereas if oak wilt comes in, it's a whole different ball game. It's very, very specific to oak, and gypsy moth is specific to oak and other species as well. But it's going to be very different if we have to deal with root grafting and disruption, and it's going to kill trees dead, whereas gypsy moth does not kill trees outright dead.
Great, thanks. So there's quite a long list of questions here, and we'll get back into them. We've got about 10 minutes. We're right on time for the next presentation. So we'll try and clean some of these up and get majority of them answered. And I think it's good if the panel can just kind of weigh in where they feel they have an answer, or whoever feels most comfortable answering the questions. So just an anonymous attendee, what's the best way to stay up to date with the status of exotic pests? Well, I think I can answer that one, actually. I'd suggest joining the Ontario Woodlot Association, not very self-serving. With our merger with the Model Forest and our participation in the Forest Health Network, great partnerships with Jim and with the Invasive Species Center and all the good work they do, we can connect you really well with our products and services, and we also feature a lot of good communications on invasive species in everything we do. I think that's a pretty decent answer. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? All right. So one from John here. What policy can be put in place by the provincial park system to stop the importing of firewood into every provincial park in the province? Can the same policies be put into place in private parks? Can firewood be a banned item across the border? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
It's Richard here, and I do know that the provincial parks are careful where they try to get where they source their wood from. And that's an issue that they've been dealing with for some period of time. But they do pay attention to invasive species and are trying to source their wood from safe locations.
Yeah. It's a fairly free flow for now, though. I think it's more a marketed or a promoted thing, not to move firewood too far afield.
Right, it's buy wood locally, and that's what the parks are suggesting. And also, when beach bark disease was, well, it's still big, but was big a number of years ago, some of the parks were really concerned about bringing wood in that might contain beach bark disease. So, for example, Killbear Provincial Park was very, very careful when it removed 6,000 cords of infected beech of where it went to what mill and what time of the year it was moved, so it wouldn't spread.
Mm-hmm.
So parks are aware of the issue of invasive species, and they're trying to address them the best they can.
Here's one from John. Is there a way to communicate with Ontario Power Generation, Ontario Hydro, or local arborists to inform them about the pruning suggestions? I think that was your presentation, maybe, Richard.
Yeah, we've the International Society of Arborists and the Ontario Society of Arborists have had numerous conferences, and we've presented at them. So that information has been presented to the arborists, but it's an ongoing educational thing. So new people coming into the organization, people who didn't attend the meetings. As Aaron was saying, the communication aspect of this disease is relatively new in Ontario, and it's going to be an ongoing event. Even states like Michigan and Wisconsin that have had the disease for a number of years. And that example I gave with that homeowner who wasn't aware of the disease bringing it onto his property. It's an ongoing communication thing, I believe. And we just can't do a few of these communications. It has to be ongoing. And that's why I think things like the Model Forest and the Invasive Species Center and CFIA and Ministry of Natural Resources are all communicating those messages, and wherever you get those messages from, it's going to have to be continuous.
Totally agree. Right on. And here's one from Dan. Are there jurisdictions in the US that have effectively controlled the disease, even if the disease has been there for some time? That actually might be a question for Bruce, who's going to be presenting next from the US Department of Agriculture. I don't know if you want to weigh in advance of your presentation, Bruce.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Okay. Can you repeat the question again?
Sure. Are there jurisdictions in the US that have effectively controlled the disease, even if the disease has been there for some time?
The simple answer is yes. And each state deals with things differently. They deal with it differently. So they may have a phytosanitary regulation in place around a hotspot, or they may just, it may just be something that's going on, but it largely depends on where the focus of management and how well they're doing there. But this thing can be effectively slowed down.
Right on. Thanks, Bruce. And we'll hear from you in a few minutes with your presentation. Another one from Blair here. Are we not also slowing down or interfering with the CODIT process? And I have to admit, I'm not sure what the CODIT process is. Anyone want to weigh in on that?
It stands for compartmentalization of decay in trees. Not really too scientific, but Alex Shigo took a lot of trees down and tried to figure out what happened after decay came in, or how much decay you could expect behind, say, a conch on a tree. So to kind of answer that question, I would say that compartmentalization of oak wilt is not something that's going on, since it's like a decay, for example. It's a wilt, so it's moving up and down the water conducting tissues. So that's live sapwood, and the tree really doesn't have a capacity over time to wall it out. Unless, as Richard pointed out, the tyloses is something that we see in oak wilt in white oak.
Yeah. Thanks, Bruce. So I got to read up on the coated processes, learn something new there today. All right, just a couple more questions and we'll get on to Bruce's presentation. So from Andrew, what monitoring programs could be implemented at a municipal scale?
I can partially respond. So good to know that we do have an adapted version of our CFI survey protocol. So basically, we can offer you the exact protocol that our staff use as far as methodology and how to assess trees. And that can be employed. Some cities do that type of monitoring, assessing branches. And then if suspects are noted, you call us in to work together on sample analysis.
Good, thanks. That's great. So one from Daniel here. Let's see if I can pronounce this right. Are the nidulid beetles, sap beetles, associated with oak wilt disease found throughout the entire range of red oak in Ontario? So nidulid. I can't pronounce that right.
Sharon will probably answer that in her presentation.
Okay, Sharon will talk to that. Okay. Excellent. And we'll do just one or two more, and then we'll get into Bruce's presentation. Gary asks, is there a contact one should make if they suspect oak wilt in their woodlot? So I think that's you, Aaron. Yeah.
Myself, for our surveillance account, there's also the report of pest function on our website, and that will make its way to our group as well to help coordinate next steps.
Great. Thank you. And from Karen, do we know if any other bordering municipalities are doing similar preventative actions as Windsor? Example, LaSalle, Hammersburg, Tecumseh, the Niagara region.
Richard here. Sarnia certainly is. And some of the other municipalities, I don't have them off by name, but they're very aware. And Sarnia, Windsor have had lots of training of their arborists, and they put public notices out. So it's people are aware. And I think even some municipalities as far west as Toronto and Mississauga have paid a lot of attention to oak wilt training as well and their staff. So it's the bigger municipalities are paying attention, and the ones certainly closer to the border have been, and doing training.
It's great. Good to see the proactive activity there. Excellent. Let's go with one last one for now. How long is cutwood left in the forest still infectious? Does the pathogen die off quickly?
Yeah, I'll answer that. The pathogen dies off quickly in dead trees. So the fungus can't grow in dead trees. So after those spore mats are produced after the first year, they're pretty well done with. And that's some research that's going on to determine how long the spore pads are actually viable for. But as far as the root systems, the fungus can stay viable in the root system for some period of time. And that's why it's important to kill the trees or remove the upper parts of the trees, the bole of the tree, so you can remove the spore pads right away. So the following spring, when if they can be removed, if the trees are determined to be infected over the winter, remove the boles of the tree during the winter so that you don't have the spore pads form in the spring, and remove, of course, any standing wood that might produce the spores.
Excellent. Well, thanks. Thank you both, Aaron and Richard, and for the answers to the question, and Bruce as well for the answers to the question. Aaron, thanks again for a great presentation. It's just good to see, again, the proactive approach to this and getting out in front of it that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is undertaking. Great work.
Thanks very much.
All right, so on to the next presentation, and we've already heard from Bruce answering a couple of questions. Bruce Molson's with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and I forget where you're joining us from today, Bruce. Is it somewhere in the States? I know, but Oh, you're on mute. You're still on mute, Bruce.
Unmute. Okay.
There you go.
I'm in Washington, D.C. I live just outside of the outskirts, so kind of where all the central activity happens. Been here since 2008. Prior to that, I worked in Missouri, where we had a lot of oak wilt, and so very familiar with it.
Excellent.
Can you see my screen?
We can. You're set to go.
Okay, and it's big and it's widespread and all of that. So, and you can hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank the folks for organizing this gathering. It's already been very informative and re-informative for me, because I've kind of been around this, and then I kind of let it go a little bit, but it's always good to touch base with folks. And I can say this from Aaron's presentation, as well as Richard's, that we have you guys have this. You've really got a good start on the things that on oak wilt and getting prepared for it and all of those types of things. So much of what I'm going to say is not to repeat what Richard said, but kind of give you an update on what the USDA Forest Service and its involvement with this disease, and how we go about doing some business. So I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about policy and how that's made, and talk to you about how that's funded. Talk to you a little bit about the unit that I work with, which is Forest Health Protection, and then just give you general updates on oak wilt and how we go about it. And then I wanted to leave you with some stuff that's been worked on by a Menominee tribe up in Wisconsin. So I'll have a little video. Hopefully that'll work, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. Couple policymakers right off the get-go is we have now a new chief. His name is Randy Moore, and he has come to us from California. So he's got a steep learning curve about all the things that go on all the way across the United States. In our recent elections, we have a new administration, but we brought back an old person, Tom Vilsack, as our Secretary of Agriculture. And when I talk about policy and policymakers, what I'm really trying to extend to you is that, and it sounds like you're doing it, but from my experience, if you're one person going to visit a congressional person, they give you tickets and you can go sit in on the either side of the House or the Senate, but that's about it. But if you have a consortium of people, and I'll say this over and over again, of interested parties, from tribes to universities to states to provinces, industry, all of those folks can form a pretty strong consolidated group, a consortium of folks that can have an impact on how we respond when we have something like oak wilt or any other types of diseases. So what's really key is you're trying to get decisions, good decisions being made. You can have the best laid plans all the way across, but if the policymakers are unaware of what's going on, you haven't presented clear values. We all know that oak is valuable and important to us. What are some of the alternatives that might work to control it or slow it down or keep it away from us? So we want to provide those policy people with the best science that we can, and when it comes available. And so it's something that requires diligence. So I wanted to say that. So with Chief Randy Moore now, we would provide him, for example, with everything that we think we know in about 5 bullet points. When he goes then to speak to the folks like Senator Haruno shown here, who sit on powerful committees that provide money to fund our operation, he has all of the things at his fingertips so he can, articulate what's going on. And I'm almost sure that that's what's going on after seeing Aaron's presentation with leaders at the local level, at the regional level, and at the federal level. So it's important that you understand that together we have a bigger mark to make when it comes to getting people interested in this. But good decision making then supposedly will provide us with some money. Forest Service operates annually right around $5 billion. Most of that money goes to fund forest management on our national forest systems or to put out fires. And then you'll note that where I work in state and private forestry, about 4% of the money that was allocated to us last year goes for everything else, which includes about 700 million acres of privately owned forests or state-owned forests and that type of thing. So then we are Forest Health Protection, the we that I'm talking about, then gets its money from state and private forestry to carry out all the things that we do. And Richard alluded to it. There's, trees are always inundated with something, and some stand out more than others. And the two things that policymakers need to know is how much that resource is worth and how much, not only its net value in dollars to industry and so forth, but the ecological value that's added by having these forests that can get oak wilt. So I said I work within the Forest Health Protection Unit. We have about 250 forest health professionals who partner with our states and our non-governmental agencies to ensure that we're dealing with insects, diseases, invasive plants, and their impacts. The key I want you to take away from this is that, we have to deal with everything from, as shown on the left there, fir engraver to sudden oak death to ips to invasive weeds and sudden oak death. All these things have to be dealt with. And I always feel very fortunate that we get to spend $500,000 on oak wilt annually, and that's split between the South and the North. That includes about 36 states. In forest health protection, we like to talk about, and you've been hearing bits and pieces of surveillance and all this other stuff, but the pillars of our approach is how much we get to decide how much money are we going to put into, say, prevention, survey and monitoring, treatments, methods that can help us improve our survey techniques, methods that might help us get a better treatment on the landscape. And then, as has been mentioned by Aaron, the outreach side is kind of what we get the privilege of putting together and getting that information out. I'm happy to report that it's been around for a while. And as Richard mentioned, my earliest recollections of this, I'd read one where 1881, someone was describing oak wilt happening on red oak in southern Wisconsin. But as Richard said, it really didn't get figured out as to what was going on until the 40s. And so there's a storied history. That's what I wanted to get across here. And sometimes it's really fun to have these documents in your hands and be able to go reference what they were thinking about as they were stumbling across this new and developing and emerging disease. So for the state side of the thing, it's been around for quite some time. And that, I think, gives us a better springboard to work from, knowing that there are all these options available to us. And I always throw one of these in any talk I give. There are principles and practices that have to do not only with oak wilt, but can do, help us as we go along with how we respond to a disease. And so the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is akin to our APHIS, or Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. And those two groups work together side by side on many things because they are the regulatory wing, if you will, of our federal government. And so they are ones that are deciding policy. But not only at the federal level, but we also have each state, which will have their capacity to, as I mentioned, put out regulations, phytosanitary regulations involving something like a disease, such as oak wilt. So we have exclusion. Let's just keep it out. That sounds like the best plan for Canada. If it gets in, what do we want to do? Well, maybe we want to eradicate it. Okay. Maybe we want to start thinking about how would we protect some of our red oak resources or at-risk resources. And then is there anything that we can do to sort of resist these things? And there's been a lot of good questions that have come up, and hopefully we'll be able to answer all of them. And I think that this is going to be a great reference to go back to as you go along. If you can pick up pieces of things from each of the great presenters that are have presented on this webinar. So you can see eradication as a cultural method. You want to get it out as quickly as possible. You can use fire, you can use chemicals, you can use, all of these things taken together. The main point I want you to get from this is that not one of these by themselves is going to solve the issue. And as Richard said, this is something that's going to be ongoing once you have oak wilt present. But in the toolbox, you want to be as integrated as possible so that when you're trying different things, and each situation is uniquely different. So say an urban situation, I used to work with a lot of arborists in the cities down in like Kansas City, and I have a similar story that Richard told, where a person had some downed red oak from Truman Lake in Missouri, and they brought it with them back to Kansas City. Well, not long after they brought it back with them, the pin oaks on the boulevard started dying and leaves started falling and things like that. So yes, this whole idea of the movement of infected material and the timing of that is very, very, very key. So when you start thinking about how are we going to manage this, my point is we're going to have to be integrated in order to achieve some success. So as has been pointed out, we've had all these maps, and you've been able to see that up to from 2004 to 2020, we're tracking oak wilt. And as was mentioned by Richard, if we have one tree in one county, the whole tree of the whole county gets lit up. And so what you're seeing in this depiction here, the darker red counties indicate recent finds like 2019, 2020. So it is something that is continually tracked on our side of the border, and it is very important to us. New York got people pretty excited when it showed up there. But as Richard has mentioned, it's within 500 meters. And so one thing that came to my mind was, as well, if it's been around since the 1800s, what are you guys doing up there that you've kept it out of Canada? So I'm kind of like, wow, that lake is either a great barrier, or you're just doing really good stewardship up there. So whatever it is, I'm saying keep it up. But it does make us want to be very concerned about where is it and where is it not. So understanding our resource, where that's located, and how much diversity within that resource is red oak or these species that are highly susceptible to oak wilt, that's a good practice. And so what we've been trying to do this past summer, I had the privilege of working with 2 students out of St. Edward's University in San Antonio. Because oak wilt does extend all the way down to Texas, they were looking for internships, and we are trying to take advantage of some of that hard work that they did and develop some dashboards. This is a new thing for us to be able to quickly provide resource managers with a tool to look at past, present, and the current thing. And it was really interesting to see Aaron's depiction of AI and how that might help us be even really much more quick in terms of early detection. So a dashboard was set up, and this is something that I want to try to do a better job of with all diseases, but oak wilt was chosen because it's a very important disease, and we spend a lot of time and money on tracking it and treating it. So these students were able to kind of come through and come up with an idea of, well, what's really important. And so in these dashboards, you can go down on the bottom here, you can see the states by number of county positives that have been positively identified as oak wilt. And so these kinds of tools are just now coming to our fingertips, and since we're all doing this whole virtual world type thing, these are real-time, real useful tools that can be used. You might have attended the Northern Hardwood Conference, and here's where I want to give a big shout out to Dr. Jenny Jeswick, who I've had the privilege of working with when I was in Missouri. We did some work on trying to figure out what were the vectors of oak wilt, and she, Richard was talking about the juicy fruit smell. She's one that can smell it. I can't. Some tell me it smells like bruised bananas. but it's one of those things that once you smell it, then you know that it's there. And she was able to walk right up to a tree and say, this tree has oak wilt, and then within a few seconds show us the oak wilt pad. So it can be an acquired taste, I guess. And what I'm really interested about showing you here is they've recently presented a poster, which is now going to be another repository of information. And like I said, with oak wilt in the US, there is so much stuff out there to try to get your hands on and wrapped around. But wouldn't it be nice if we had one place where we could go and get our questions answered on things like the biology, which Richard did a great job on, and the distribution and how we detect it, and factors that affect it, and what might be some management strategies we can employ. So it's going to be a helpful tool. All I can say is they wanted it to come out this summer, but it's looking more like it's going to come out in December. And once that happens, I'm going to delegate Richard as the point of contact to get you the link to this, because I've been able to, sort of play around inside this story map. And basically what it is like a PowerPoint presentation that you can take on at your own pace. And it's just literally filled with more information on oak wilt than you can possibly get your hands on, providing lots of links to state guidance and additional resources that who do I contact if I've got oak wilt, what does it look like, how much of that resource is in a particular area. So a lot of questions can be answered. So I just pulled a couple. This is showing you distribution and severity, but we also have detection and surveillance methods. So there are various things as you scroll down this panel on the left. It provides you with really quick handle on what's being done in terms of how we survey for this oak wilt. One of the other places, and this is something that we've seen a couple of times now, is a place to go and find out about where could we prevent things from happening. So wherever you see these red marks, you're seeing what sort of strategies can be implemented if you get oak wilt in your woodlot. So preventing the transfer of the fungus is, as Richard pointed out, is key. Preventing the pathogen from it getting to the root system, that's key. Disrupting that connection between trees. And I'm going to point this out. There's some differences in the way oak wilt behaves. So for example, in the north, sandy, loamy soils, you get much larger oak wilt centers, as we call them. So those can be detected from there. Where I worked in Missouri in a natural forest, you might pick up one tree and could see a tree next to it sort of showing some symptoms, but it was just a little flash pot type on the landscape. So it was almost kind of difficult to really figure out how much oak wilt you had out there, because there's a difference in the soils, much more churty type soil in Missouri. So there are very little opportunity for these root grafts to form. So it's maybe just entirely dependent on overland spread, but there are differences. And then when you get down to Texas, that's a colonal species, the Texas live oak, which is very much connected by root connections. But the first infection always has to come from a red oak that's been infected pressure pad. And I don't know how far away that could be, but once it gets in central Texas, most of those trees are connected below ground. And so it just goes from tree to tree. So that's why they take a lot of effort, or do a lot of effort in suppressing oak wilt in Texas. So this site is going to be available, and I'm hoping very much to be able to get that to Richard sometime maybe in December. So check back often. It can, again, the idea being that we communicate with one another where these things exist. So just showing again some of the things that you've seen. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is that if you are worried about the beetles, you can tarp over the winter and through the fall and prevent the beetles from moving out. Best to get it off the landscape as quickly as you can. It was shown that we've had vibratory plows that can be used and strategies to retain certain oaks versus to get the disease oaks out. And as was shown, Texas, of course, is everything's bigger there, but again, they have very much cherty type soils, so they have to really go to some extremes. And one story I'll tell about that is they were in a municipality and they were trying to save the live oaks in that municipality, but one homeowner decided no, they didn't want to do any of this root graft disruption. and so basically they just cut with this big saw all the way around that person's property and avoided them. So there are those things that you can do. It's been mentioned that you can inject with Alamo if it's a high value tree. If you can't get the trees down after you've determined they're infected, there are methods of going ahead and doing a couple cuts with the saw and maybe some herbicide to make sure that the tree no longer has water uptake to prevent any more above tree spread from above tree pads. There is some hope out there for logs. People ask this question all the time about veneer. Dr. Jenny Jeswick has been working with vacuum steam approaches to what we would call high-grade logs that will be used for veneer. And that's something that's been very utilized by APHIS as well. They're very interested. The Port of Baltimore is very interested in this device. And what essentially goes on there is that the log will be put inside this chamber and the temperature will go up and the vacuum will occur and the steam will be applied. And so the results from those logs that may have had oak wilt in them, and Jenny's done this both with naturally infected logs as well as intentionally infected logs. And so we have been able to show that this method would actually keep the value of that particular log, quite large size log, intact. Some other things that research has been looking at is trying to figure out spectral analysis and things that go on. Can we pick up the signature early through sort of reflective incidents off the ground? And there's been some work done at the University of Minnesota that's underway, where they feel pretty confident that they can detect oak wilt in stands that they've flown over in Minnesota. So this is something, and so hyperspectral analysis is on the horizon. And this also takes advantage then of remote sensing from satellites and drones and planes and things like this nature. And I will say that this is going to be as a developing research, you can see from 1970 to 2020, more and more of this is being applied to, it gets our eyes on the issue quickly. And then from that, we can implement our toolbox of control. One other thing that Richard mentioned, and I always put this one up here, Nitidulids are fungal feeders. That's what they like to do. And so can we detect, and it was mentioned environmental DNA? Yes, we can. And there are many different methods that can be used to take the spores off the back of these beetles and run them out on an agarose gel to determine the presence or absence of a fungus. But again, we're only talking that, it may be present, but may not be localized or established anywhere. So these surveys of looking at, I'm sure Sharon's going to talk a little bit more about this. We do have some of these tools that are available to us so we can get a better, again, early detection of what's going on in our neighborhood. It was also mentioned that there have been applications that are used on phones, and in Europe, they're trying to track down ash decline, so you can get an app downloaded to your phone, so you can start to do some of this real-time stuff that I think will help us get that early detection and get us in order to understand. Beech leaf disease is something else that we've been wondering about. And so there are apps that you can download and take a picture of and upload to the cloud. And from there, we get all this information gathered. I always say that, the device that Spock has there wrapped around him is where we are heading. We need to have a tricorder that will be able to tell us how much, how bad, and what's next. And so I have a high hope for technology as we move forward. But as Richard also mentioned, and Aaron did too, is communication between all of these folks and all of these gadgets, if you will, has to be maintained. That costs money, and it also needs people that kind of operate in a way that they know what that information means. So quality control is important. Somebody may send something in, but it may not actually be an oak. You can have that kind of thing. So citizens monitoring, I think, is a great way to get people's eyes on the situation, whether you're a woodlot owner, municipality, or whatever. All right, I'm going to take a little moment, and hopefully this is going to work. You'll start to hear some birds chirping. Can you see? Is this running for you?
It is running okay there.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is a Menominee Indian reservation, and they work.
Our history of Menominee has been woodland people. That's their background. Their history is to be part of the land, part of the earth, part of the surroundings. As the early Menominee leaders started to make their decisions about harvesting timber on the reservation, they always maintained a concept that they never wanted to harvest more than what the forest can provide. Basically, that was the early concept of sustainability, saying that you'll never take more than what can be provided for each replace itself.
Any way you can turn the volume up a bit, Bruce?
Let me try.
Sometimes we like to say that to varying degrees, almost every tree species has a threat. Native species. Oak wilt is a fungal disease that moves through the xylem, is transmitted by insects. Trees typically wilt and lose their leaves very fast. So they'll turn brown and mottled green. All the leaves fall down very fast, like in a week or two, and cover the ground in a halo right beneath the trees. In essence, you want to amputate the disease. It's about all you can do. There's nothing that can cure it in the forest setting. You have to nip the disease off like gangrene.
My name is Jeff Brito. My Menominee name is Penominee, means seen going by. I'm head of the Forest Development Department here on Menominee for Menominee Tribal Enterprises. My role is to regenerate the forest, maintain the forest, create diversity, and look towards the future. My ultimate goal in the oak wilt areas is to recreate the elder plant communities using science as a tool guided by Indigenous wisdom.
At NIAX, we developed an adaptation workbook for helping managers integrate climate change into their management decisions. And so working specifically with MTE, we were thinking about how could we meet their objectives for the long-term sustainability of their forests and the cultural and economic resources that it provides. And then integrating climate change as an additional layer on top of that. So when it came to the oak wilt sites, how could we find species that are going to be better adapted to future conditions?
What we're trying to do is diversify the stand with a little bit more climate hardy species of trees in here. On this particular site, it's bur oak and white oak, which will be introduced within the northern red oak for this area. So the main purpose of this isn't to grow large sawlog trees with every species that's put in here. We're aiming for the few bur oak that will eventually take on that responsibility of an elder tree species. That's the purpose. The secondary trees are helping it along. We have kind of worked with bringing one or two of the species south of us in the next zone over up here to plant basically as one of the fringe trees on the outer fringe, kind of as a indicator of what the stand's doing. If the bur oak and the white oak slow down on their growth and the fringe plant starts picking up its growth, That's an indicator sign. When we do our thinnings in the forest, we don't really target a species so much to market it. What we do is we make our selections first with the batting order of high risk trees, low quality trees, trees with poor form. Those are the first selections we make. And we always want to maintain the diverse stands. And that's kind of a response to climate change, is to have your forest growing in such a way that it's maximizing its strength and health so that it can withstand any problems or pressures that come up.
Okay. That was a great video, and that is some work that's being done on 300 oak wilt centers on the Menominee lands, and it's a way in which we can take advantage. Sorry to say this, but you know, the oak wilt has come through. They have responded to it, and if that didn't come through very clear, just let me know. I can send you the link that goes to that particular video. But what I wanted to get across there was that so in these oak wilt pockets, we're able to maybe start to look at what the future forests might look like in the presence of climate change. And so I think there's some unique things that are going on there. So again, all of us have, I think, a role and responsibility to make keeping this out of Canada and to keeping it out of Ontario and Quebec. And we can do that through various means, but again, I think the key for me is always diligence. I've seen sudden oak death and people getting what I call sudden oak death burnout. You know, you don't want to get oak wilt burnout. And so something comes in, it's novel, it's exciting, and all kinds of researchers want to work on it. And then all of a sudden, well, okay, that's that. And a new thing has come, like beech leaf disease is causing us some new issues or something like that. We need to be integrated and strategic. And certainly I think you folks have got a framework in place that's going to be very good. And we must remember that together we have much more powerful voice to the policymakers that are going to provide money that will help us continue to help us deal with oak wilt. So communicating that oak wilt importance to them is very vital. And that's why I'm very glad this group has been called together, and hopefully you are picking up many things. As was mentioned, there's this oak wilt response framework for Canada. There are links that should be able to get you to that. And it's a very good read as to what people are thinking and how they're expecting to respond. And with that, I believe I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Bruce. Great presentation. I'd love to get the link to that video to share with the audience and others, including, in fact, our entire membership and distribution list, many thousands of people. So excellent.
Will do.
Yeah. So we got a few minutes for questions before the final presentation with Sharon. So I'll just get back into those. And it's kind of, again, situation where I think whoever's feeling most comfortable to answer on the panel can answer. But here's one from Kenneth. In areas where oak wilt has been present for many years, have any individual trees survived, possibly due to some minor genetic variation as has occurred in the Dutch elm disease? These trees can be a source of cloning.
That is an excellent question. And when I had my slide up there showing the principles, and you saw down there on protection, you know, resistance is always something that I think we do too late. So we find out, let's say, about emerald ash borer, and we want lingering ash. If we would have started on the first day that we knew emerald ash was our ash was in trouble with trying to find those resistant phenotypes and trees that we could maybe select from, we'd probably be further along than we are right now. But there are, you know, it's kind of a pattern. People get going on that resistance side of the coin, and it has been successful with Dutch elm disease. There are on our mall in Washington, D.C., there are clones. And if you take a close look at the mother tree and the two trees on its side, they have withstood Dutch elm disease. And so it is, again, a component of our approach of being integrated. I'm not aware, though, maybe Richard, you are, of efforts that have been done to try to select trees that would maybe be more tolerant of oak wilt.
I'm not aware of any, Bruce, in Canada or in the States.
Yeah. So, that is a very good question and a good point. Perhaps we can be looking, and again, being integrated about it is going to be very key.
Thanks, Bruce. From Jennifer, would you recommend painting stumps during a winter harvest of an oak woodlot, similar to historical use of borax with red pine? Richard, that might be one for you.
Yeah, I can answer that. No, I don't think it's necessary because those stumps would dry out over the winter. So if the stumps have been cut in the winter, then there's no need. If they're cut any other time, then I would say it's probably worthwhile spraying those stumps.
Thank you. From Brianna, what is the best way to deal with removed trees? Can you chip them, or do they need to be burned?
I can answer that one too. They can be chipped because once the fungus is dissipated and is broken down, as it's been mentioned many times, it's colonized by other fungi very quickly. And that's one of the big problems with sample collection, collecting samples the proper way, putting them on ice, is that if once the wood is exposed, other fungi overgrow the oak wilt fungus very quickly.
Thanks, Richard. And from John, is there anywhere in Europe or the Eastern Hemisphere where oak wilt has been reported?
I can answer that too if Bruce doesn't. It has been found in Italy, and it was transported there from my understand, and there's a couple of stands that I believe have it there, and with eradication being attempted. Yeah. And it's interesting to note that we always talk about our invasive species, what's coming to Canada and North America, but we are just as guilty as other nations around the world of spreading things. And Canada has a whole whack of invasive species that we've donated to other countries that aren't very fond of us as a result.
Yeah, that's a whole interesting discussion. We often think of the things that have come to us, ALB, EAB, and other things from over there in the Asia area, but we've sent pine wilt nematode to them, and it's had a far greater effect than it does in the Americas. But in terms of, I wanted to get another point that just this got me going is that where did it come from? That question came up. And if you read Jennifer's paper, a phytopathological review, they were speculating the Central Americas and that it came up that way. So, again, the search is always on for these things. Where did it originate, and how might that help us? So that's just one other tidbit of information that I wanted to pass.
Right on. Thanks both. Let's do one last question before we get Sharon up and doing her presentation. So from Ryan, how does one become a member of the Oak Wilt Technical Advisory Committee? I think that might be for you, Richard, if that was raised in your presentation.
No, I think that's actually Aaron's.
Okay.
It's a CFIA leadership thing.
Okay. Aaron?
Yeah, so membership is fluid. We do recruit new participants based on areas at risk or people leading new initiatives related to oak wilt. It's primarily limited to federal, provincial, and municipal partners. So if someone has a good case for why they would like to be involved and what they may bring to the table, we always would entertain that.
Excellent. Thanks, Aaron. All right. Well, we've got more questions in the queue, but we'll get on with our final presentation. So I'd like to introduce Sharon Reed, who's with the, and this is a mouthful, Ontario Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources and Forestry. I'm getting really good at saying that. OMMDMNRF. I'm going to be able to say it backwards soon. Anyway, Sharon, sorry to make fun of your your long title organization there, but yeah, Sharon's going to talk to us about the Ontario sort of update, what's going on with the beetle vector surveys and the results. So take it away, Sharon.
Thanks, Sean. First, I just want to check and make sure you can see my slides, because with the way my screen is set up, I can't see what you're saying. So
Okay, we can't see anything just yet, but
still nothing?
still nothing, I'm afraid.
Okay, let me exit out and try to start it up again. All right. All right.
Okay, it's starting up
Okay, great.
and we can see it. Perfect. It's in presenter mode on this side though, just so you know, Sharon. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm just going to talk to you today about some research that our lab and our collaborators have been working on since we started in 2018 with some preliminary research. I actually started on this topic when I met with Richard. And I was a new scientist here, and he was telling me about some of the gaps in our knowledge for Ontario. Okay, here. All right. Okay, so first of all, before I start the presentation, I just wanted to point out that we do have a lot of collaborators that we're working with. Among those, John Sweeney and Corey Hughes at Natural Resources Canada, Fiona Ross from Manitoba Agriculture Resource Development, Jennifer Llewellyn and Hannah with Ontario's Ministry of Agricultural, Food and Rural Affairs. We also have a new project with Dr. Kira Ball at Michigan Technological University. Okay, so as Richard said, oak wilt is caused by an invasive fungal pathogen called Bretziella fagacearum. The fungus colonizes vascular cells in the tree, blocking water movement. Trees in the red oak group are the most susceptible, with some trees dying within a few weeks of infection. Trees in the white oak group are more resistant, and death or partial death can take years. Once a tree dies, the fungus produces a mat that raises the bark from the wood surface. The resulting crack allows insects to crawl under the bark to reach the sweet-smelling fungus. So scientists have found communities of insects associated with the pressure pad and spores of the fungus. Insects crawl, feed, and lay their eggs on the fungus. Some insects prey on other insects that visit the mats even. Between the 1940s and 1960s, scientists described which insects were visiting oak wilt mats to determine which insects were the most likely vectors. After many collections in different states, it was decided that knitted beetles, sometimes called sap beetles, were the most frequent visitors of these mats. Scientists also found spores of the fungus on knitted beetles, and that placing contaminated beetles on trees could lead to oak wilt infections. The fact that sap beetles also visit wounds and sap flows on healthy oak trees was further evidence that they could transmit the disease. There are many different species of sap beetles, and they have different lifestyles. Most species feed on fruits, grains, decaying vegetation, and fungi, but these beetles can also be predatory or feed on flower pollen. If you garden, you've probably seen these beetles on your raspberries, decaying squash, or trying to get into ears of corn. For example, the little beetle on the right side, when we were picking raspberries this year, I found hundreds of them all over our raspberry crops. When I pulled plants out of the garden that were starting to wilt, I look at the base of them and I could find the same beetles also crawling around some of that dead vegetation, probably because there was some type of fungus growing on the dying plant. So some of these species are important agricultural pests because they're feeding on grains and fruits, introduce yeast and other fungi that cause rot. Knitted are considered the primary vectors of oak wilt in the northern states. After a tree dies of oak wilt, the fungus produces pressure pads and spores during the time of year when it's warm and humid. Like Goldilocks, spores aren't produced when it's too hot or too cold or when it is too dry. So spores are typically produced in late spring, early summer, and fall. Fungal feeding nididuli beetles live on and feed on the spores. Spores become attached to their bodies. At some point, the nididulids leave the old pressure pads and take flight. If a freshly wounded oak tree is nearby, they may be attracted to the wound and start a new infection. The wound could be a branch broken by wind, construction damage, a pruning wound, a gash from a bear claw. Any new wound that reaches the sapwood can become an infection point. The reason that oak wilt is so difficult to control is because it also spreads below ground, as Richard was speaking about. The root system can live for many years, even though the above ground part of the tree died. If the roots of a healthy oak tree is connected to the roots of an infected tree, the healthy tree will become infected with oak wilt and show symptoms the following year. If the root connections between oak trees aren't broken, oak wilt spreads each year, creating expanding pockets of oak mortality. There are no cures for oak wilt infected trees. Bulldozers and vibratory plows are often used to break connections between roots. Trees that are dead, dying, or soon to be infected below ground must be removed and the wood destroyed or treated to stop fungal pressure pads from developing. Treatments are checked yearly to make sure the treatment was successful. Stopping overland spread by nididulids is considered the best way to prevent new infection centers from developing. This approach has been used in Midwestern states. One way to stop overland spread is to limit oak wounding when trees are most likely to be infected. In order to develop this type of management in Canada, we need to answer several questions. First, we need to know which species, nididulid species, will be important carriers of the disease in Canada. Different species are important vectors in different regions of the United States. We can do this work by determining which species visit fresh oak wounds and using the literature to determine which species are attracted to the oak wilt fungus. Finally, we need to know when these species are flying from infected trees to trees with fresh wounds. To answer these questions, our partners set up traps across Eastern Ontario, Manitoba, and New Brunswick. This map shows where flight traps, which are the diamonds and the squares. So diamonds, flat traps, or flight traps. The squares are where flight trapping and wounding occurred, and stars are where only wounding occurred. So we were working around Winnipeg, Manitoba. We had a number of sites here in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, where I am located. We also had locations around North Bay, Ottawa, Northumberland, Guelph, and Essex County. Oh, and I think I almost forgot to mention New Brunswick as well, around the Fredericton area. So in order for a species of nididulid to be a vector of oak wilt, they must be attracted to and crawl on oak wilt mats, as well as visit freshly wounded oak trees. Not all nididulid beetles are attracted to oaks, and not all oak-seeking nididulids arrive early enough to infect the tree with the fungus. We wounded red oak trees in 2 provinces and bur oak trees in 3 provinces. Circular wounds, 5 centimeters in diameter, and you can see in the top right photo the hole saw that we used to create those wounds. Then we peeled the bark plug from the wound, and crazy as it seems, once we peeled that plug of bark from the wound, we actually put it back into that spot and nailed it to the tree so it wouldn't fall out. And what that did was create a little refugia for the nididulids to crawl under the bark to the sap, just like they would if it was a natural wound. Since the risk of oak wilt infection is greatest when wounds are moist, we returned 8 hours and 72 hours after the wounding to collect the beetles. To determine the flight patterns of the nidatulids, we place flight traps at 3 or more locations in southern Ontario, northern Ontario, Manitoba, and New Brunswick. We also place temperature sensors near the traps. Our partners made weekly collections between March and November. The collections occurred in 2019 and 2020. And you can see in the photo, one of the types of traps we used was this wind vane trap that was baited with the sex pheromones for the beetles as well as bread dough bait. So between 2019 and 2020, we collected 47 species of nidatulids from 48 traps. There were more than 43,000 beetles. And the other on the right side is a second type of trap we used, the Lindgren 12 unit funnel trap. We found 5 nidadulid species considered primary vectors of oak wilt in fly traps throughout Canada. So there was a question earlier that had been asked about it. So many of these species we found in the flight traps were present throughout Canada. There was a 5th species that is known to transmit oak wilt, Colaptes semitectus. That's the picture on the bottom row. That was only detected in southern Ontario, so it may have a more limited range than some of the other species. So we identified 12 species that visited red oak wounds and an additional species that visited bur oak wounds. It was a common thread throughout the study that we found that nidadulids behave differently around red oak trees than they do around the bur oaks. The 2 most common nidadulid visitors to oak wounds were species considered primary vectors in the Midwestern United States. So that was Carpophyllaceae and Colaptes truncatus. So we then searched the literature to determine if the species we found in oak wounds were attracted to or carried spores of the pathogen on their bodies. We found reports of beetles visiting the fungus or carrying spores for 8 of the 12 species that were associated with the oak wounds. 3 of the species were rarely reported in the literature. So those are species that are not highlighted. So either those species are not associated with oak wilt fungus or they're simply not reported frequently in the United States. One species, Carpophyllus lugubrious, is a common agricultural pest of corn and is not reported visiting oak wilt pressure pads. So then we used our flight trap data to make degree day models for 7 of the 12 nidadulid species found in oak wounds in Canada. We used a free, widely used program called BioSim to gather temperature data, and we chose the Allen sine wave method to calculate degree days. So insect development in flight is dependent on air temperatures. This means that the start and end of flight changes every year. In a particularly cold year, a species may become active in May, but be active in April in a warm year. If the insect overwinters in an immature stage, it might need warmer temperatures and more time to develop than an insect that overwinters as an adult. To reliably predict when insects emerge, enter different life stages, and undergo peak flight, scientists use degree days instead of calendar dates. Degree days are a measure of heat instead of time. This approach has been successfully used in pest management programs and can be used to improve research for oak wilt. Degree days models are more accurate than calendar dates because their accuracy is independent of year-to-year variation in weather. So I wanted to give you an example of how degree day models are developed. So I just randomly created some temperatures and to go through with you so that way you better understood what the process that we had gone through to create these degree day models. So in this example on March 1st, the maximum temperature is 8 degrees Celsius and the minimum temperature is 0. And if you average those and use the very simplest possible model that you could for degree day modeling, you would get an average of 4 degrees Celsius. For nitidulids, it's been suggested that the development of the insect occurs at temperatures over 5 degrees Celsius. So that particular day in this scenario on March 1st, it never was warm enough for insect development to occur. So we have a -1. So on the right-hand side, I have the degree days accumulated. So for that particular day in this scenario, you would say there were 0 degrees days accumulated. The next day on the 2nd of March, it's a much warmer day in this scenario. It's a high of 12 degrees Celsius and a minimum of 2, giving an average of 7 degrees Celsius. So you would take the 7 and minus the 5 associated with the development of the insect, and you would have 2 as your result. And those 2 degree days would go into your accumulated degree days column. The next day, March 3rd, in this scenario, it's a little bit cooler, but about the same as the day before. You end up with an average 6 degrees Celsius, which is 1 more than the base of 5. So you would take that 1 degree Celsius that you've accumulated on the 3rd of March and add it to the 2 from the 2nd of March, and then you would have 3 degree days accumulated. So normally when you develop these degree day models, you would start on January 1st. A location like Essex, down in Windsor, you would expect you might start seeing some degree days at the end of January or in February, whereas up in Northern Ontario, where I'm located, you may not see any degree days develop until the end of March. Okay, so this histogram combines the flight data from all of our locations and years. This is one of the nice benefits of the degree day models, is being able to take data from widespread areas and many years and condense it down into one data set. So in this graph, instead of using calendar dates at the bottom along the x-axis, we have the degree days going from 0 to 500, 500 to 1,000, and 1,000 to 1,500. And on the y-axis, we have the number of beetles collected over this time period when the degree days were being accumulated. And the histograms that I've included for this slide are Carpophyllaceae and Caloptis truncus, which are 2 well-known vectors of oak wilt in the United States. And then I've included Apuria vara, which is also another species that we found frequently coming to oak wounds and consistently from year to year. So just to demonstrate the difference in the patterns with the degree days. So each one of the black bars are 50 degree days. The dotted lines is when 50% of the insects were collected for that species. So with Carpophyllaceae, the one on the top, we started seeing beetles by 50 degree days. We collected 50% of the beetles in the flight traps by 350 degree days, that dotted line. And you can see that the flight peak was occurring all at once in the late spring, early summer. And flight continued throughout the growing season, but there was very little flight compared to that early summer, late spring period. And we really saw the same pattern for the other species, Caloptis truncatus. Once again, it wasn't the earliest flyer. We collected 50% of the beetles by 300 degree days. We had one big flight period, and then a few individuals that were actively flying later on in the growing season. But it was interesting to see with a species like Apuria vara, this species emerged earlier. We collected 50% of the population much later in the growing season, around 600 degree days. There was the same peak flight period in the late spring, early summer, but there's also a lot of flight activity occurring later in the summer, possibly a second flight period or peak flight period. And that could indicate that there's a second generation, or it could be a behavioral change, that the beetles are moving from one part of their environment to another, looking for a different food source. The next step in our project was to determine when flight typically starts in each of our study areas. To do this, we downloaded 30 years of historical temperature data for each of the different regions in our study. We used the degree day models we created for each species to determine the time of years beetles flight typically starts and when 90% of flight has occurred. We also used the data to determine the earliest time that flight started and the latest time we would have expected 90% flight. All right, so I just can take some time to explain this graph because it's a little complicated when you first look at it. So if you look at the gradient bar, and hopefully you can see my pointer on here, where it's the white is where flight first starts, and that's based on degree days again. So this is when typically, using that 30 years of data, we would accumulate enough degree days that flight would start. The end of that gradient is when enough degree days have accumulated that 90% of beetle flight has occurred. These hash marks at the beginning, those would indicate a year when it's the spring or the late winter is really warm, and so we would see early flights of these insects. And then the hatch marks at the end are representative of really cool years when beetle development takes longer and you would have a longer, more drawn out flight period. So we've displayed the data for two species, Colaptes truncatus and Carpophilus sayi. There's the top row for each one of these species is based on Manitoba's data. Then Ontario is the next three, ecoregion 5E, which is Northern Ontario, ecoregion 6E, more South Central, and then ecoregion 7E, which is the warmer area along Lake Erie. And the last one is New Brunswick. And I'm just going to focus on the Ontario data. For Colaptes truncatus, we found that flight typically starts a little bit after April 1st. You can see that as you move northwards, then flight typically was starting in the middle of April, and up in Northern Ontario, flight of Colaptes truncatus typically wouldn't be expected to start until just before May. For the 90% of the flight occurring, that would typically always occurred before August 1st. So Erin mentioned earlier that that not to prune your oaks between April 1st and July 31st, which fits, with this model that we've developed. You can see from the hash marks that there is potential for flight of Colaptes truncatus along the Lake Erie area earlier, but again, that's only in these exceptionally warm years. For Carpophilus sayi, we see similar patterns, but Carpophilus sayi, the flight starts a little bit later in the season. So along Lake Erie, we typically wouldn't accumulate enough degree days for flight to occur until mid-April. And then in Northern Ontario, it would be just before May 1st that we'd start seeing flight of that species typically. Again, the Carpophilus sayi, most of the flight was occurring before August 1st. I do want to point out that there's these little beetles on the graph, and those beetles represent when we have 100% of flight. Right? So here for Colaptes truncatus, it had most of its flight early in the growing season, but then we were still collecting beetles in October in Ontario. Carpophilus sayi we are still collecting beetles at the end of September for Ontario. So, so the greatest risk is between the April 1st and the July 31st, but there's still some risk, some potential for oak wilt infection later in the season. Researchers in the Midwest usually find that there's less oak wilt infection in the fall period, and it's thought that that could be due to the insect behavior. So this summer, we collected additional flight and temperature data. We plan to use this third year of data to test the accuracy of our models. We want to build additional models. I'm going to be talking about another project that we've started, and we've actually identified additional species that are going to oak wounds. So we want to see if we can build models for those species as well. And we want to also look into the future and determine how climate change will affect beetle flight. All right, so this past year, the same team of Canadian researchers started working with Dr. Tara Ball from Michigan Technological University to better understand why oak wilt has spread slowly along its northern border. The work is being performed at sites with and without oak wilt in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, as well as Canadian sites near Winnipeg, Sault Ste. Marie, Guelph, Albion Hills, near Toronto, and around Fredericton in New Brunswick. And Tara has sites throughout the Upper Peninsula. You can see my pointers on 3 of those locations. She also has one site that does have oak wilts. So we're collecting getting some interesting data from that location. So I've created this diagram to better explain the project. In this diagram, the colored bars are the degree days, and they're progressing, accumulating over the growing season. We're using the flight traps again at each one of these locations to document the flight of the beetles throughout the growing season. And at the same time, we're wounding the trees. And before, when we were wounding trees, we were only wounding them a few times in the year. So either in April, May, June, or July, depending on how far north the location was. This time we're wounding the trees weekly from April through August to better understand that timing of when the neodulids are actually visiting those oak wounds. And we have weather stations at these locations as well, recording air temperature, humidity. We're also looking at factors that are related to sap flow, like soil moisture and temperature. And then Dr. Tara Ball down at Michigan, with her site that has oak wilt present, she's been collecting the knitted dulid beetles and crushing those beetles and spreading the macerate of the beetles onto nutrient media to see when those beetles, like when the spores, viable spores, are present on the beetles. So by doing all this work, we're hoping to look a lot more closely at the timing of these 3 different components to better understand how well these components fit together and how many days or how much risk there is of oak wilt developing in some of our more northern areas. So the other added benefit of this project is we're also asking if we can more accurately define the high risk period for oak wilt infection. So when we wounded the trees between 2018 and 2020, the neodulids rarely visit the oak wounds before May in Southern Ontario and June in Northern Ontario. So we're hoping that by regularly wounding the trees, we will determine if the high risk period in the spring can be better defined. And so I already showed you this graph in an earlier slide with the degree days and the 3 different beetle species. But at the bottom, I've added the percentage of successful wounding events and how that corresponded with the degree days. And before 100 degree days, even though we had many different types of beetles flying, we only had one beetle found in a wound prior to that time, even though we had doing quite a bit of wounding during that time period. And we found that as the season progressed, the beetle visitation had increased. So we're really hoping we can refine this high risk period for Ontario. And Aaron talked briefly about the oak wilt detection that Guillaume Bilodeau and Philippe Tanguay are heading up. I just wanted to give a little update about that. So I'm going to just advance here. And so our participation as lab is that we worked with Michigan's DNR as well as our partners in Ontario. So that would be City of Windsor, Essex Regional Conservation Authority, the St. Clair Region Conservation Authority, and Sault Ste. Marie Conservation Authority. We worked with them to put out traps along the border, and in Michigan, they were putting their traps, flight traps, in locations with the oak wilt fungus. And that was done over a 3-year period, putting out the traps, collecting fluids over a 2-month period, and then sending them to Guillaume and to Philippe. And what they found for Ontario, from the Ontario and the Michigan samples, was that they were able to develop a highly sensitive qPCR test to detect the pathogen. They detected the pathogen in 31 samples, including 10 from the Michigan USA site in 2019. And they also worked with a newer technology as a high throughput sequencing metabarcoding approach. You can look at a whole bunch of genes from many different organisms at the same time. And they also were able to develop that technique to look at samples there to detect the pathogen in the Michigan samples, and also then the one sample that from Sarnia, Ontario. And you can find more information about that environmental DNA detection at the Invasive Species Center website. In 2020, we did the only positives were the Michigan samples. And so again, this past year, we worked with collaborators to collect samples again for 2021. So hopefully next year we can share some of the final results from that study with you. Okay, so in conclusion, the sap beetles are common insects that feed on decaying tissues, fungi, and fruit. Oak wilt infections can occur any time in the growing season, but the risk of oak wilt infection is greatest from April to August when primary vectors are most active. We are investigating wound visitation and vectoring of the fungus to determine if the risk period can be even better defined than it currently is. And more information is needed to determine if other species are important vectors, especially this Epiravirus species that frequently goes to wounded oaks in Northern Ontario. Right, so now I just want to say a thank you to a number of people that were involved with the collection of the data. The weekly collections of beetles would not have been possible without Jason Pollard from the City of Ottawa, Todd Farrell from Northumberland County Forest, Jeremy St. Ange and his colleagues from Canada College, Paul Garreau and his staff from the City of Windsor, Rob Davies, Dan Levitic from Essex Regional Conservation Authority, Tim Payne from St. Clair Regional Conservation Authority, and Brandon Williamson and John Enright from Upper Thames River Conservation Authority. A beetle identification was done by Sylvia Greifenhagen, Corey Hughes, David Kitzwitz, and Kevin Barber. And I want to thank Monique Wester for assistance with developing the degree models. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.
Well, thank you, Sharon. It's really interesting and great work. And again, delighted to see your proactive approach to things, and MND, MNRF leading that. So excellent. So we're getting to the point where we don't have too much time left, but we can finish off the answers, or the question and answers that are remaining. There's about 12. So we can burn through those, and I'll just invite anyone on the panel to pipe in when they or to pipe up when they feel they can answer it for us. So let's give this one a try. John asks, are there existing penalties to mitigate the movement of firewood into Canada and into provincial and private parks in Ontario? Education failed to stop emerald ash borer. We had a similar question earlier. Anyone want to take a stab at that? No.
Where's this question at?
I think that's an Aaron question. Aaron,
Yeah.
are you there still?
Yeah, I'm here. I was trying to figure out how to get off mute.
Okay.
It's more of a policy question than science, but basically anyone who's found to be not in compliance with the established acts or regulations put in place for various pest issues would be penalized under the act. So there could be monetary penalties associated with that, so fines, as well as at the commercial level, it gets much more costly. So non-compliances are dealt with in accordance with our policies and acts.
Thank you, Aaron.
And I can speak from the province, or I'm not a province member anymore, I'm MNRF, but with the Invasive Species Act, oak wilt hasn't been added to that list as far as I know yet. So it's just a federally regulated pest, not a provincially regulated pest as of yet.
Thanks. And one from Blair. You mentioned beech bark disease. Is it having a resurgence?
I can speak to that. No, I don't think it's having a resurgence. Beech bark disease is found pretty well throughout the range of Ontario. Surveys done in the past has found it anywhere that beech is found. There may be a few stands where it's not in, but it's certainly in and around those stands or those areas.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say from our point of view, as I mentioned, beech leaf disease is a newer player on the landscape, and we're trying to track that one better and surveil it and try to understand what are some of the implications on top of beech bark disease.
Right on. Thanks.
And I think Sharon can add something more to that on the beech leaf disease aspect that's going on in Ontario. This might be appropriate here, Sharon.
Yeah, well, I will always, if you think you see beech leaf disease, please report it. I will say, so it's fairly well documented in the counties along Lake Erie, but this year we did detect it in Northumberland County. It's also detected in the city of Hamilton. We had a detection 2 years ago in Toronto. So really suspect that it's probably distributed along Lake Ontario. And we definitely would like to hear more about that. Our lab has been doing confirmations for beech leaf disease whenever the sample is coming from a new county. So, and we share that information with our collaborators in the States, and they develop these beautiful maps. So that way we have a nice international map tracking beech leaf disease.
Right on. Thanks, Sharon. Are there any other insect vectors than the sap beetles?
For oak wilt, we're going back to, I gotta put my brain back to oak wilt. So there's also been suggestion that oak bark beetles could be a vector of oak wilt, and some evidence of that in the southern United States, but traditionally it's been thought that the new dulids are the primary vector in more northern areas.
Right on. Thanks. And is there an age class that is more affected than another? And it looks like, Bruce, you're already answering that question.
Well, I was gonna throw it out there for the panel as well. In my experience, they're fairly well mature trees, established trees. I really don't have an age class. I mean, I know of people that have done inoculation studies on seedlings, but I know of no reports of the fungus actually being then transmittable through that. And we do get on the old trees, saplings that come out, or sprouting that takes place. So, and some of that has not been, to my knowledge, reported to being infectious or, having the fungus. So where I tend to see it a lot is in the mature trees, that are along streets. That's where my primary experience with it has been. But in the forest, it's a good sized stand of mature trees. And I guess I was looking at that question. Another one that I answered is that we are talking about when you see something that's infected, I'm going to go out on a limb, no pun intended, that it's a mature tree.
Just a question from Leah. How does disease actually kill the trees? What does it actually do that kills them?
Richard?
Yeah, well, it's actually destroying the vascular tissue. So we talked about tylosis, and basically what the tree does is it closes all its cells, its vascular tissues, so it dies from strangulation, if you like. As Bruce mentioned, there's no nutrients going up or down the tree from the leaves, and there's no nutrients coming down from the tree. So eventually the tree starves and dies because of lack of vascular tissue functioning. So tylosis are like little balloons in straws. And if you have a little balloon, or if you're sucking on your orange juice and you get a lot of pulp caught in the straw, then you're not going to get any orange juice coming out the other end. And that's maybe a poor analogy, my wife would say, but it kills the trees by starvation. So that's why they wilt very quickly. Mm-hmm. And because the fungus can move up and down in the vascular tissue, it goes down the tree and then comes back up the next vascular system in the tree, the xylem, and it kills the crown very quickly and the tree.
Thanks, Richard. Good explanation. Just a comment here from Ron. Thank you to all the presenters. Very informative and comprehensive. Special thanks to Bruce for joining us from south of the border. Very nice, Ron. Thank you. And I think another comment here from Blair. Taking into account the information provided on the various graphs, it appears that the best, safest time to prune would be November through February. Yes? So he's kind of just wanting a reaffirmation of that. Thank you. So November to February, best time to prune?
Well, as Sharon research is showing, that's what's showing up for us in north of the border. But I think as Sharon's work works out more, and Sharon, you can best answer this, probably pruning anytime in the winter months makes it easier when there's no leaves on the trees and there's no bugs flying. And of course, there's still lots of questions to be asked about how long are the spores viable? And there hasn't been much work done on that as far as I know. So the beetles might be flying, but are they carrying viable spores? Are the spores viable? Mm-hmm. So my best suggestion, I think, for Ontario presently or anywhere is not to prune during the active growing season, not just from leaf out, has been reported to, bud flush to 2 or 3 weeks after leaf out, but maybe not at all during the actual growing season, just to be safe.
Yeah.
I would echo that and agree that there's a little jingle that the Department of Natural Resources in Minnesota had, don't prune April, May, June. It had a nice little song that went with it and everything that got played on NPR quite a bit. So people were alerted to this, but yeah. And as Richard said, that xylem is a very interesting niche for diseases to begin with. Not a lot of diseases, make their home in that environment. So if you get down to Texas, let's say, I would say that wounding anytime down there is probably, on a red oak at least. But where they run into the greater problem is in the root systems being connected and being a clonal species. So they're tied to one another from the get-go. So they're kind of a closed community, and that's why the sanitation and suppression projects that we support down there are so important.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's something to add on that, as what Sharon was pointing out with, the growing degree days being the best indication of when the beetles are available and when they're moving around. That is so true from the science perspective, but often what policy folks try to do is put dates on things like months so that the public can understand it best. because you saw how complicated, or maybe complicated, that model of growing degree days is. It would be pretty, I think, interesting for the province to say, oh, oak wilt is available now on April 15th of this year. Don't prune your trees. So we get into trouble, and that's where a lot of that controversy arose in the States, is don't prune between May and June, and then somebody else would say don't prune between May and July, and then August, and then September. And of course, as Bruce pointed out, the phenology of when these trees are coming out and the insects are available down in Texas, they're probably flying all year round. but are the spores viable? So I think sometimes when we try to put policy into things to simplify it for the public, it makes it more complicated, and it raises more science questions of how we can take very exact science and then dumb it down so that we can apply it universally across the landscape. And that's why I think the work that Sharon is doing is terribly important, because whatever work was done in the southern states, really doesn't apply to the northern states. So maybe what's happening in the northern states is Sharon's found a new beetle involved in this. So the science part is terribly important, and often we don't give that enough attention, or I hate to say that we use the science that's done in the States, which is good science, the work that Jennifer and all those people have done, but we are a little bit further north, and with climate change and these movement of these species, both trees and insects, we need to keep up to date.
Thanks, Richard. Excellent. Just a few more questions and we'll wrap it up. I know we're a little over time, but lots and lots of good discussion here. Just Lara's asking, can we please repeat how many beetles are known to carry the oak wilt fungal spores?
So I don't have an exact number for you. I can tell you that there's 5 or 6 species that are consistently associated with oak wilt fungus, and that it changes. And Bruce can attest to this because he was involved in some of this oak wilt research. He found that Caloptris semiotectus and Caloptris truncatus were important vectors in Missouri. But then when you go up to Wisconsin, Minnesota area, then it's Carpophilus say and Caloptris truncatus. In Texas, they have different species. So there are multiple species, and I think one of the things I was talking a little bit about that Puree species in northern Ontario. That's a species that's not reported very often in the United States in these studies. So it could be that it's just more abundant here, and that so that's why it could be associated with oak wilt fungus if we have the when or if the oak wilt fungus arrives here. We just don't know, if that'll be a strong association or not.
Thanks, Sharon. That's great. Just a follow-up question on, do we know how far an interdalded beetle can travel within a year, and do they visit many trees? Or are they happy to stay on 1 or 2 trees for the duration of their life cycle? Are we looking at multiple kilometers or a few meters? Anyone want to try that one?
I guess I will say that the literature is not, there have not been detailed studies on distance for nidulid species. I find that many of these species, how far they move really is dependent on what food source is available. If they don't have to move, they're not going to go very far.
Right, and that's pretty well, it's pretty well known that they don't fly very far, but it's not known how far they fly. And some information coming from upstate New York in the Finger Lakes area, where the Finger Lakes are sort of a ridge of mountain ranges there that are actually just small hills, but they call them mountains or hills. There's some evidence that they can blow some distance. So when they're on the top of a hill and the prevailing wind is from the west, and these hills seem to go north-south, there's been anecdotal reports by their pathologists and work there that they're blowing some distances from the west to the east, a couple of kilometers they're reporting. And that's kind of important to them because they're finding some outbreaks that are far from the urban outbreaks. So they're urban outbreaks around people's houses. And these are, fancy houses that are in the hills. And then they're finding outbreaks some distance away that they're detecting by air and wondering how they got there. It's not the movement of firewood. So there might be some wind vectors involved, and that's still an area that's not really well known or researched. And I'll leave it at that.
So 2 more questions. What temperature do the spores ripen at and are ready for disbursement? Anyone have an idea for that one?
Well, I'm gonna just speculate a little, when the pads are formed and this vector comes to them, that, that's in the spring of the year as they're pushing out, the pads are pushing out. So, spring-like temperatures, I would say, once that pad is formed, that's where the inoculum is going to be. As Richard's pointed out, if it's been dried out from the year past, these beetles, and Sharon, you can correct me if I'm wrong, overwinter as adults. And so they're going to emerge to go to the fresh pad. So some timing is probably needed there for that window of opportunity, and then subsequent spread over land.
Thanks, Bruce. And one last question. Young elm seem resistant to Dutch elm disease for a number of years. Are young oaks at all resistant to oak wilt? And if so, why are they resistant?
Richard, I'm just going to let you take that one.
Okay, well, I'm doing a little speculation. If the oaks are in an oak pocket of oak wilt, then they do become infected through the root-to-root grafting. So that's how they're going to be susceptible. But other than that, I can't think of. So I think, can you just read that question again? Because I have one.
Basically, young elm, when they're young, they seem resistant to Dutch elm disease. It's only when they reach a certain age that they die off or become infected. Is oak wilt the same, or are oak the same with oak wilt?
No, okay, now I got the question better in my head. No. So if there's a wound on that oak, it can become infected. With Dutch elm disease, you need a bark beetle to hit that tree. And the bark beetles are more attracted to older trees. And that's why we often see them, especially in southern Ontario here or eastern Ontario. If you're driving by the farm fields, you'll see a whole row of elm and they look quite healthy. And when they reach a certain age, usually about 30 or a DBH of about 6 inches, I say, they become more attractive to the elm bark beetles, both the native and the invasive European elm bark beetle. And those beetles are only attracted to the older trees because that's where they feed and they breed in older declining trees. But if the root system gets infected in those young trees, so if you think along a field again, a farm field with a row of trees in the ditch kind of thing, if one of those trees becomes infected, then the root system will infect all those young trees. So that's an important question when people are managing elm here in Ontario. If you can have an elm tree that's not connected to the younger elm trees and it's isolated, it can do quite well. And you'll often see a very large elm tree in the middle of a field or far away from other elms. And that's because the bark beetles haven't discovered it or found it. They again are pretty poor flyers and don't go long distances. So if you have a lot of trees in the area and a stand of trees in the forest, then they can diddle hop and find those trees. But the younger trees are usually protected unless they get root to root graft infected.
Right on. Excellent. Well, thanks there, Richard. That's great. Well, that's it. We've answered all 50 or so of the questions. Pretty amazing. And I just, I've really learned so much today. It is just an excellent, comprehensive, informative session. I want to thank Richard and Aaron and Bruce and Sharon. Just great job. On behalf of the Eastern Ontario Model Forest, the Ontario Woodlot Association, and the Early Detection Rapid Response Network and the project, the Invasive Species Center, and all the partners of the Forest Health Network. Thanks so much. And I'll ask Jim if he wants to say some final words at all, if he's able to unmute himself and say something. Jim, I'll let you finish it off.
I would like to thank everyone for joining us this morning. I would like to thank the presenters. Richard, thank you very much. And Aaron and Bruce and Sharon. We put this together. You folks put this together. You spent all the morning, but on top of that, you spent the time putting everything together. So we thank you very much. And those that are online, we have given you the tools to go and be observant for this oak wilt. And to Bruce, I have no idea why it hasn't crossed the border yet. You have had it down there so long and yet has not crossed the border. So again, thank you very much. And also to you, John, thank you very much for moderating this morning. Great job, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, Jim. Always my pleasure. All right, everyone have a great rest of the day. And again, this will be out there in cyberspace with a link so you can play it again. Play it again, Sam, and enjoy more and pick up more on oak wilt. I won't say enjoy more, but pick up more on oak wilt that you might not have absorbed during the live presentation. You can revisit it. So take care, everyone. Have a great one.